Have you ever stood on a misty hillside and wondered what ancient footsteps might still echo beneath the grass? Long before Rome marched north, before kings built castles or scribes inked their chronicles, there were the Celts, a people whose world stretched from the Atlantic shores of Ireland to the heart of Anatolia. For centuries, they were dismissed as barbarians, little more than wild tribes on the edge of history. But what if I told you their story was far older, far stranger, and far more influential than we've ever been led to believe? A civilization without borders. A culture that left no single empire, no great city, and yet reshaped Europe in ways that still define it today. They built with myth as much as with stone, spoke to gods in forests and rivers, and carried ideas that would outlive their kingdoms. Tonight, we're not just tracing the rise and fall of a forgotten people. We're following the quiet heartbeat of a world that refused to vanish. So settle in. Wherever you're watching from, a quiet room, a darkened city, or a calm night's edge, let the story of the Celts remind you that even in silence, history still whispers. Long before names were written, before nations had borders or kings claimed crowns, there was Europe vast, green, and breathing beneath the weight of time. Forests rolled from the edges of the Alps to the misty shores of the Atlantic. Rivers wound through endless meadows, their waters silver beneath the moonlight. And among these landscapes, small bands of people moved quietly, hunters, farmers, wanderers, whose stories lived only in the wind. These were the ancestors of the Celts, not yet a people united by name or language, but threads in a great human tapestry that stretched back to the Bronze Age. Around 3000 BCE, waves of Indo-European tribes began to spread westward from the steppes north of the Black Sea. They carried with them not only tools and animals, but an invisible cargo, words. Words that would one day form the Celtic languages, distant cousins of Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. The movement was slow, generational. Families followed rivers, herds, and seasons, leaving behind little but footprints and the faintest echoes of their speech. One calm discovery emerges from this ancient quiet. Even before the Celts, Europe was already a crossroads of exchange. Amber from the Baltic traveled south. Obsidian from the Mediterranean found its way north. Though separated by forest and mountain, early communities shared symbols and patterns that hinted at a collective imagination. Spirals, suns, and circles carved into stone. They were reminders that long before history was written, humanity was already telling itself stories about the world. By the second millennium BCE, these early tribes began to settle more firmly in Central Europe, near the salt-rich mountains of what is now Austria. The control of salt, that quiet preservative of life, became the seed of trade, wealth, and eventually hierarchy. Salt did not glitter like gold, yet it was more valuable than gold could ever be. It kept food through the winters, allowed travel and exchange, and sustained settlements far from the sea. Around these trade routes, new communities emerged, the forerunners of what archaeologists now call the Hallstatt culture. Imagine that world at night. Smoke rises from hearths within timber houses. The faint clang of metal echoes from a forge. In the soft light, artisans work bronze and early iron into tools and ornaments, their patterns already showing the curves and spirals that would later define Celtic art. There were no empires here, no towering monuments, only hill forts and villages nestled among trees, each one a quiet world unto itself. Yet in this stillness, the foundations of a great civilization were taking shape. Another calm discovery. The earliest signs of social hierarchy in these communities are not fortresses or laws, but graves. In the burial mounds of the Hallstatt heartland, archaeologists have found chariots, weapons, jewelry, and imported goods from as far away as Greece. These were not the trappings of conquest, but of prestige, a language of status expressed through the careful placement of objects beside the dead. Each grave was a story told in silence, a reminder that even in prehistory, humans sought meaning in how they remembered their own. The forests around these settlements were sacred. They offered wood for homes and fuel for forges, but also mystery and spiritual weight. Early Europeans saw no divide between the natural and the divine, Rivers, trees, and stones were alive with presence. This worldview would linger through the centuries, shaping Celtic religion and myth long after the last Hallstatt chiefs were gone. To them, nature was not a backdrop to human life. It was a partner, a rhythm to move with. By 1200 BCE, Europe entered what we now call the Late Bronze Age. The balance of life began to shift. Populations grew and trade intensified. New metals, stronger, more durable, began to circulate. Iron, dark and transformative. The transition was gradual but profound. Iron changed everything: farming, warfare, and craftsmanship. It gave small tribes the means to defend themselves, to cultivate more land, and to carve their place in the landscape. Here lies another gentle insight. The Celts were born not from sudden conquest or invention, but from accumulation of tools, of trade, of time. Their emergence was the slow unfolding of continuity. The Hallstatt communities were not isolated. They were the living midpoint between the Bronze Age's ritual beauty and the coming dynamism of the Iron Age. The people who lived in these valleys likely never thought of themselves as part of something larger. Yet when archaeologists sift through their settlements, their pottery shards, bronze pins, and fragments of language, patterns begin to appear. A shared way of shaping metal. A shared reverence for the circle. A shared rhythm in burial rites. These quiet consistencies are what historians now recognize as the first heartbeat of Celtic identity. From the Carpathians to the Danube, from the Rhine to the Alps, a loose cultural web stretched across the continent. Its people spoke related tongues, traded similar goods, and worshipped under the same open sky. The Hallstatt world was not an empire, but it was a civilization in spirit, defined by art, mobility, and connection. Picture it again, near the end of the Bronze Age. The night air carries the scent of pine and smoke. A river gleams under the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a bronze horn sounds, summoning a small gathering to a hilltop. They share food and stories, perhaps about ancestors who came from the east, or spirits who dwell in the forest. Their words are foreign to us now, but the feelings behind them, wonder, fear, belonging, are eternal. It is here, in these gatherings and shared rituals, that we glimpse the essence of the Celtic world. Community woven through memory. They may not have written books or built cities, but they left something more enduring, a cultural continuity that would survive migrations, invasions, and centuries of forgetting. As the centuries passed, these settlements grew richer, their crafts more refined. Trade routes stretched farther south, connecting them to Mediterranean civilizations. In return, new ideas flowed north, writing, mythic forms, art styles, blending into something uniquely their own. The Celts were not a single nation, but a mosaic of peoples bound by rhythm rather than rule. By around 800 BCE, their world stood on the threshold of transformation. The Hallstatt culture was reaching its zenith: powerful chieftains, wide trade, and artistic brilliance. Yet even as they prospered, change stirred beyond the horizon. To the west, new lands beckoned. To the south, foreign traders brought stories of marble cities and gods carved in stone. And so the age of the Hallstatt pioneers would give birth to the Latin visionaries, those who would carry Celtic culture to its fullest expression. The forests, rivers, and hills of Central Europe would remain, but the people would begin to move outward, across the continent, carrying with them the language, art, and beliefs that would shape 1,000 years of history. As the firelight flickered in their homes and the stars watched in silence, the foundations of a great civilization were being laid. One that would one day echo across all of Europe, only to fade again into mist and legend. And so, as the night deepens and the ancient world turns in its sleep, we leave these first dreamers behind, to follow the next dawn, when the Celts will awaken and begin to name themselves beneath the bright horizon of history. As the centuries unfolded, the quiet settlements of Central Europe grew into something more defined, a landscape of hillforts, trading posts, and sacred valleys that together formed the Hallstatt world. This was no sudden empire, but the steady ripening of an idea, a culture learning the shape of its own reflection. The name Hallstatt comes from a small lakeside village in modern-day Austria, where a vast necropolis was discovered beneath the soil. Within it lay over 1,000 burials, dating from roughly 1200 to 500 BCE. The graves revealed a people of complexity, warriors and artisans, nobles and common folk, each resting with care among the possessions they once cherished. Here were iron swords, bronze cauldrons, salt mining tools, and jewelry of intricate design. A civilization of artisans and merchants had emerged, and through their hands, the Celtic spirit began to find its form. One calm discovery from these tombs lies in the evidence of connection. Among the bronze and iron relics are foreign luxuries: amber from the Baltic, coral from the Mediterranean, pottery in Greek styles. The Hallstatt people were not isolated mountain dwellers but participants in a continental network. Rivers were their highways, mountains their watchtowers. Their settlements stood on strategic ridges, overlooking valleys rich with trade. Each hill fort was both home and heartbeat, a node in the early map of European civilization. To imagine this world, picture a clear morning after rain. Mist drifts between green hills. At the crest of a fortified ridge, smoke rises from hearths. Blacksmiths shape glowing metal while traders unpack bundles of woven cloth and salt. Beneath the wooden roofs, songs echo, rhythmic, repetitive, like the beating of a drum. Time passes slowly here, not counted in days, but in harvests, festivals, and generations. Salt was life. In the mines of Hallstatt, tunnels extended deep into the mountain. By torchlight, miners carved out blocks of crystal-white salt with bronze and iron tools, hauling them upward through dark passageways. Salt preserved meat and fish. It sustained livestock through winter. It allowed trade to flow between valleys otherwise divided by terrain. It was not wealth in the modern sense, it was continuity, a way to hold back decay, to extend the breath of life itself. Through salt, the Hallstatt chiefs grew powerful. Their wealth was buried with them, not as vanity, but as gratitude to the earth that had sustained them. Among these chieftains, hierarchy was emerging, a subtle shift in human organization. The graves tell the story. Some were plain, others monumental. In a few, archaeologists found four-wheeled wagons and imported Greek pottery, signs that elite families had forged diplomatic ties far beyond their mountains. The Hallstatt world was thus both local and global, grounded in its valleys but open to distant exchange. Another gentle insight. In their art and craft, we glimpse the early grammar of Celtic imagination. Metalwork from this era shows flowing lines, curved symmetry, and motifs of animals and nature. Not rigid patterns but organic, rhythmic forms. The designs suggest motion, life, and transformation, as though the world itself were in constant flow. This aesthetic, born in the Hallstatt heartland, would evolve into the iconic spirals and knots of later Celtic art, a visual language of eternity. The people themselves were diverse. They spoke dialects that would one day branch into the Celtic tongues of Gaul, Britain, and Ireland. Their clothing, woven wool, dyed in earthy reds and greens, marked both region and rank. They raised cattle, grew barley, and celebrated the turning of the year with communal feasts. Their society was neither primitive nor uniform. It was a living fabric of tribes and families, adapting gracefully to the rhythm of their landscape. In this world, belief and daily life were inseparable. The Hallstatt people honored the spirits of nature, rivers, stones, and trees, with offerings cast into water or buried in fields. Rituals took place in sacred groves rather than temples. There was no priestly caste yet, only elders and seers who read signs in smoke and stars. The later Druids of the Celtic Age would inherit this connection, the quiet understanding that wisdom is found not above nature, but within it. Through this lens, the Hallstatt horizon feels less like the beginning of a civilization and more like the awakening of memory. These were people who already understood balance between craft and spirit, between land and trade, between individuality and kinship. Their art glowed with confidence, their burials with reverence. Each object found in the earth is a whisper of continuity, proof that even in an age without writing, humanity was already fluent in meaning. In time, their influence spread. From the upper Danube to the Rhone, from Bohemia to Bavaria, the Hallstatt culture became a web of related societies, each echoing the same artistic rhythm. The tools they forged, the ornaments they wore, and the rituals they practiced reveal unity across vast distances. They traded not only goods but symbols, and symbols endure longer than kingdoms. One of the most striking discoveries is how the Hallstatt people perceive death. Their grave goods suggest belief in an afterlife where status and beauty mattered, yet the arrangement of offerings feels deeply personal, not ostentatious. A bronze comb placed beside a woman's remains, a drinking horn beside a man's, gestures of quiet care rather than display. Death, to them, was a continuation, a passage to be furnished with familiar comforts. Archaeologists have even found textiles preserved in salt, delicate threads still visible after 25 centuries. To touch them is to touch time itself, to feel, faintly, the hand of a weaver who lived and laughed in a vanished world. This is the most peaceful kind of discovery, not of conquest or collapse, but of endurance. By 800 BCE, the Hallstatt culture reached its height. Trade thrived, craftsmanship flourished, and the first hillforts rose in prominence as centers of power. But the world beyond was changing. To the south, the Greeks were shaping philosophy and art. To the east, the Etruscans were building cities. Their influence began to ripple northward, carried by merchants and travelers. Imported amphorae brought not just wine but new ideas, of geometry, of myth, of ornament. Yet the Hallstatt response was not imitation. It was transformation. Their artisans blended foreign motifs into local patterns, creating something distinctively European. This quiet synthesis of North and South, of Bronze Age roots and Iron Age ambition, would soon give rise to a new cultural flowering, the Latin civilization. Before that dawn, however, came a pause, a still moment in history's rhythm. The Hallstatt world stood balanced between eras, its people unaware of the transformations to come. They lived surrounded by beauty, by silence, by the slow continuity of life. Their story reminds us that civilization does not always announce itself with walls or monuments. Sometimes it grows in the hush of valleys, in the shimmer of metalwork, in the songs of people who never imagined they were making history. And when the light of the Hallstatt world began to dim, it did not vanish. Its patterns, beliefs, and spirit flowed onward, like a river feeding new lands. Out of its valleys would emerge a more connected, expressive, and expansive Celtic world, one that would soon stretch from the Iberian Peninsula to the Irish Sea. As the fires burned low on those Austrian hills, a new generation prepared to shape iron into art, to forge myth from memory. The Hallstatt horizon would fade, but its glow would light the path ahead, toward the awakening of the Celts as a people of vast imagination and enduring mystery. And so, as the night deepens over the quiet lakes and forgotten mines, we turn our gaze forward, to the next dawn, when the Celts begin to recognize themselves not only as tribes, but as a civilization bound by art, spirit, and the eternal rhythm of the earth. What vision guided the hands that shaped metal into spirals, forms without beginning or end? What dream lingered in the heart of a craftsman as he traced the curve of a golden torque, or engraved flowing lines upon a blade meant not just to cut, but to speak? By the 5th century BCE, on the northern shores of Lake Neuchâtel in what is now Switzerland, a new rhythm of life began to stir. Here, in a place later called Latin, the Celtic imagination reached a luminous maturity. It was not merely a new style of art, it was an awakening of consciousness, a revelation of what it meant to be Celtic. At the water's edge, archaeologists found remnants of a wooden bridge, fragments of weapons, ornaments, and chariots cast into the shallows, offerings to unseen gods. The lake had been a sacred mirror, and into it the people of Latin poured their devotion, their fears, their gratitude. From this sanctuary, the spirit of a civilization radiated outward. The Latin culture did not arise in isolation. It inherited the quiet strength of the Hallstatt world, its craft, its reverence, its sense of continuity, and carried them into a new age of expression. Iron was now the common medium, but under Celtic hands it became something more than a material. It became a language. The art of Latin is instantly recognizable. Flowing curves, spirals, tendrils, and motifs that seem to move even when still. To look upon it is to see energy itself, the pulse of nature frozen in metal. Every line turns upon itself. Every space feels alive. Scholars have debated whether these forms held symbolic meaning, whether each spiral represented life, death, or rebirth. But perhaps their meaning is simpler, more profound, an attempt to express the eternal motion of the world. Through this art, belief took shape, and through belief, a civilization began to see itself as one. Across Europe, from Bohemia to Brittany, the Latin aesthetic spread like wind through trees. Each region added its accent, yet the core remained unified. A chieftain's sword found in France might echo the patterns of a drinking vessel unearthed in Hungary. Brooches, shields, torques, all carried the same visual rhythm, as if made by kin separated by distance, but joined by spirit. Trade routes expanded like veins across the continent. Amber from the north, wine from the south, tin from Britain, glass from Italy. The Celts were now deeply entwined with the classical world. Greek and Etruscan merchants encountered them along the Rhone, astonished by their skill and their taste for beauty. In return, the Celts absorbed influences without surrendering identity. They reshaped everything they touched into something unmistakably their own. Imagine a Celtic workshop during this age. A low fire glows in the hearth. Iron heats to a dull red. The air hums with quiet rhythm, the rasp of a file, the hiss of quenching water. Around the craftsman lie fragments of earlier works, half-formed designs scattered like dreams in progress. On the table rests a golden neck ring, the torque, smooth, heavy, and sacred. To the Celts, the torque was more than ornament. It was a circle of strength, a symbol of vitality and divine connection. Warriors wore them into battle, kings into ceremony, and gods into myth. The Celts' artistry was matched by their adaptability. Their settlements spread widely, from Iberia to Ireland, from the Danube to the Thames. Each tribe had its own chiefs, its own dialect, its own traditions, yet they shared a sense of kinship that transcended geography. They were not a single empire, but a constellation, independent stars bound by invisible gravity. In their world, power was often personal, tied to charisma rather than conquest. Leadership flowed through gift-giving, feasting, and the art of persuasion. Feasts were central to their life, places where alliances were sealed, songs composed, and stories retold by flickering firelight. Poets, bards, and storytellers held a sacred role. They were the memory keepers, the vessels through which identity endured. It is here, in the Latin age, that we begin to hear the early notes of that Celtic voice, poetic, circular, and deeply attuned to nature. Their myths spoke of cycles of transformation, of heroes who crossed into other worlds not through conquest, but through curiosity and fate. Their spirituality did not separate the divine from the mundane. Rivers, trees, stones, all were alive. Time was not a straight path but a circle. Life was motion, not destination. Even in warfare, the Celts expressed this duality. Ferocity and artistry intertwined. Their swords were long and elegant, their shields adorned with swirling patterns. Ancient writers like Polybius and Diodorus described their bravery, their loud battle cries, their shining jewelry glinting in sunlight. To outsiders, they seemed wild and impetuous. To themselves, they were participants in a sacred dance of life and death. The Latin world also marked the dawn of Celtic mythology, not yet written, but carried in song. The tales that would later echo through Ireland and Wales, of gods who walked among mortals, of transformations and timeless heroes, have their spiritual roots here. They were born in forests and fields, shaped by the rhythm of rivers and seasons. And still, beneath all the vitality, there was peace, a profound stillness in how they viewed existence. The Celts did not build vast stone cities or towering monuments. Their grandeur was internal, expressed through art and story rather than architecture. They left behind not ruins of empire, but whispers of meaning, flowing across centuries. When night fell upon the Latine lands, fires glowed softly from hilltop forts. Below, lakes reflected the moon, and the air was filled with the hum of insects, the murmur of wind through oak leaves. Somewhere, a craftsman set aside his tools. The spiral he had been carving was unfinished, yet perfect in its incompleteness, a reminder that all creation, like life itself, continues beyond the hand that shapes it. Through the centuries that followed, the Latine style became the very fingerprint of the Celts. It adorned their weapons, jewelry, and sacred objects, carried in trade, in migration, and in memory. Even as the world around them changed, as Rome rose and borders hardened, this art endured, quiet and defiant, like a heartbeat beneath the noise of empire. The awakening at Latine was not merely an artistic event. It was a turning point in the Celtic soul, the moment when beauty and belief became one language. From this source flowed not just design but identity. The Celts had found their voice, and that voice would carry across continents and centuries. The spiral, endless, flowing, alive, had become their symbol. And as the waters of Lake Neuchâtel reflected the stars, the Celts, too, began to see themselves reflected in the wider world, not as tribes scattered across forests and plains, but as participants in a shared cosmic pattern. Their story, from this point onward, would expand in both geography and imagination. For beyond the Alps, across the rolling plains of Gaul and the wind-swept shores of Britain, the Celtic name would soon echo in the tongues of merchants, poets, and conquerors alike. The night grows deeper. The fires at Latine burn low. The age of discovery gives way to the age of encounter. And so, as we turn the page to the next horizon, we follow the Celts outward, toward Gaul, Britannia, and the clash of worlds that would define their legacy. Beneath the stars of Gaul, the fires of countless hearths whispered the same ancient tongue. Night settles softly over the vast heartland of Iron Age Europe. From the misted valleys of the Rhone to the dark forests of Bohemia, from the fertile fields of the Seine to the mountain shadows of Helvetia, a quiet world hums with life. Here lived the tribes who formed the living core of Celtic civilization, the Boii, the Helvetii, the Aedui, the Sequani, the Arverni, and dozens more whose names, though weathered by time, still echo faintly across the map. Each tribe was a world unto itself, self-sufficient yet connected by kinship and custom. Their territories were marked not by stone walls but by the reach of rivers and the rhythm of forests. The Celts of Gaul and Central Europe did not see their lands as possessions, but as living companions, generous when treated with respect, fierce when abused. The soil was sacred. The seasons were prayers. A traveler moving quietly through these lands would have encountered a tapestry of small kingdoms and settlements, some perched atop fortified hills, others nestled beside meandering streams. These hill forts, known as oppida, were the heartbeat of Celtic life. At their center stood wooden halls built with care, beams carved with flowing designs, hearths warm with constant flame. Smoke rose gently through the rafters, carrying with it the scent of oak and roasted grain. Within, families gathered not just to eat, but to share stories of ancestors, of gods, of the unseen threads connecting all things. By day, the heartland thrived in activity. Farmers tended fields of barley and wheat, guiding wooden plows pulled by patient oxen. Blacksmiths worked in forges that glowed like captured suns, hammering red-hot iron into plowshares, blades, and jewelry. The air was filled with rhythm, the soft ring of metal, the murmur of livestock, the rustle of wind in grain. Every act was both practical and reverent, an offering to continuity itself. Among the most respected figures were the smiths, the keepers of fire. To the Celts, their skill bordered on the mystical. They transformed raw ore into form and function, shaping civilization from earth and flame. Archaeological finds, tools, weapons, delicate ornaments, still carry the echo of this reverence. The smith's hammer was not merely a tool. It was a bridge between the physical and the divine. Beyond the forge's lay markets, open spaces where traders from far and near exchanged goods, ideas, and stories. Roman wine amphorae have been found in Celtic territories long before Caesar's conquest, proof of vibrant commerce that stretched from the Mediterranean to the northern seas. Amber, salt, tin, and furs moved across great distances, carried by merchant caravans and riverboats. Along these routes, the Celtic language flowed too, softening and reshaping across dialects, yet retaining its soul, musical, alive, and bound to oral memory. The Boii, who gave their name to Bohemia, were among the largest of these tribes. Their lands stretched from modern-day Austria to the Czech plains, a region of rolling hills and deep forests. They were both warriors and artisans, their reputation known as far south as the Adriatic. Coins minted in Boii territory show the graceful fusion of Greek designs and Celtic abstraction, proof of a culture confident enough to absorb and transform. To the west, the Aedui of Burgundy held a unique position. They were known for diplomacy and learning, serving as intermediaries between tribes and foreign traders. Their capital, Bibracte, stood on Mount Beuvray, an oppidum surrounded by terraced fields and workshops. Excavations reveal streets lined with wooden houses, evidence of planned construction and thriving industry. It was a city of peace and exchange, where chieftains met to deliberate under the guidance of druids, and where bards recited genealogies that reached back into myth. Further south, the Arverni ruled the highlands of central Gaul, a proud and wealthy tribe famed for their independence. Their lands were rich in resources, and their chieftains commanded loyalty not by tyranny, but by generosity. The Celtic model of power was circular, not vertical. Authority flowed through giving, through hospitality, through honor. A great feast could secure more allegiance than an army. Meanwhile, in the Alpine regions, the Helvetii guarded the mountain passes. Their homeland was a meeting point between Italy and Gaul, between the plains and the peaks. They lived in harmony with a harsh but majestic landscape, cultivating resilience and pride. The Helvetii would later enter Roman chronicles for their migrations and their battles. But in this calmer age, they were farmers and herders, shaping terraces on steep hillsides and raising sturdy cattle with quiet devotion. Across all these lands, the Celtic spirit expressed itself through community and continuity. Life was shared, and knowledge flowed through oral tradition. The Celts did not rely on written records. Their histories lived in memory, carried by poets, elders, and druids who wove wisdom into rhythm and rhyme. To listen to a bard's song by the fire was to step into a living archive, a library of voices that never slept. These oral traditions served more than memory. They bound society together. Through them, people knew their origins, their gods, and their responsibilities. Myths of heroes, river spirits, and shape-shifting deities were not distant tales but reflections of everyday truth, reminders that the world was full of unseen life. Religion in the heartland was intimate and immediate. Sacred groves stood where temples might in other lands. Offerings were placed in springs and lakes, left for the gods of water and renewal. The Celts saw divinity everywhere. In the call of a raven, in the twist of mist, in the curve of a riverbank. To walk through their land was to walk through a temple without walls. 3 calm discoveries emerge from this world. Continuity as sanctity. Every generation saw itself not as owners of the land, but as caretakers of an ongoing story. Time was cyclical. Death and life were 2 halves of one rhythm. Beauty in the everyday. Even the simplest tool was made with care, often adorned with design. Art was not separate from labor, it was its natural expression. Unity through memory. The shared oral culture gave coherence to diversity. Though hundreds of tribes existed, they were one civilization in spirit, their voices harmonizing beneath the same stars. To visualize their nights is to glimpse peace in motion. The moonlight lies over wide fields, illuminating wooden palisades and distant fires. From hilltops, the glow of forges rises like stars drawn to earth. Children fall asleep to the murmur of stories older than their grandfathers. The air smells of earth and smoke and wildflowers. The world feels whole. Yet, beneath this serenity, change stirs. The Celts were not an isolated people, and their horizons were widening. Trade brought them knowledge of far-off lands, of Greek art and Roman politics, of the lure of conquest and migration. Their craftsmen began to carve foreign coins, their chieftains to dream of distant glory. What had been a heartland, inward, spiritual, self-sustaining, was preparing to look outward, toward rivers and frontiers yet unknown. As their numbers grew and horizons expanded, the Celts turned outward, toward conquest, travel, and trade. The embers of the heartland glowed softly in the dark, and from those embers, sparks began to fly, eastward toward the Danube, westward to the Atlantic, and southward into the world of marble and empire. The quiet tribes of the interior were becoming wanderers, warriors, and dreamers on a continental scale. The next age awaited them, an age of meeting, mingling, and the first true collision between Celtic freedom and the machinery of empire. Along the slow rivers of Europe, wealth moved like light, unseen, but shaping every shore it touched. Before empire carved its boundaries across Europe, the rivers were the first highways of civilization, long, reflective paths winding through forest and plain. Along these waters, the Celts became merchants of both matter and meaning. Their boats, carved from oak and guided by quiet current, carried not only goods but ideas, whispers that bound the continent in unseen ways. In the soft dawn of the Iron Age, the Danube, the Rhone, and the Rhine formed a triad of living arteries. From the black soil of Central Europe to the salt air of the Mediterranean, these rivers connected mountain and sea, tribe and trader. The Celts built their lives beside them, listening to their rhythms, learning their moods. The rivers gave them transport, defense, and connection. In their waters flowed the pulse of a continent in motion. The Danube, vast and unhurried, gathered its sources in the Black Forest and meandered eastward across the heart of Celtic Europe. It touched lands of the Boii, the Taurisi, the Scordisci, and countless others, carrying their goods downstream to the world beyond. Barges laden with salt, amber, grain, and iron drifted with the current, guided by men who knew every bend and eddy. To them, the river was not just a trade route but a teacher, patient, generous, and alive. Farther west, the Rhone carved its silver path through the lands of the Aedui and the Allobroges, descending from alpine heights toward the warm blue of the Mediterranean. Here, at ancient crossings like Lyon and Vienne, Celtic and Mediterranean worlds met. Greek merchants from Massalia, modern Marseille, sailed upriver with amphorae of wine, olive oil, and fine pottery. They returned with northern treasures, metals, hides, salt, and slaves. Between them, a quiet commerce of symbols unfolded, Greek letters appearing on Celtic coins, Mediterranean motifs flowing into Latin designs. And to the north, the Rhine wound through dense forests, its banks alive with settlements and watchful eyes. It marked both a frontier and a corridor, a space where Celts traded with Germanic peoples, balancing kinship and caution. From its upper reaches to the North Sea, the Rhine carried bronze ornaments, woven cloth, and stories of distant lands. Through these rivers, the Celts joined the ancient network that linked Europe to the known world. The amber routes stretched from the Baltic coast to Italy, their paths lit by the golden glow of fossilized resin, a substance prized by Greeks and Etruscans alike. The tin trade, vital for making bronze, connected Celtic Britain and Armorica to southern Europe. Caravans moved slowly along forest paths, resting at hillforts that doubled as markets. At each stop, goods changed hands, languages blended, and the great web of exchange tightened its invisible threads. Picture the stillness of dawn on the Rhone. A Celtic barge pushes off from the bank, its hull heavy with salt blocks from inland mines. The water ripples outward in soft circles. Along the shore, Smoke rises from hearths where women prepare bread from ground barley. A child watches the vessel fade downriver, carrying not only goods but the promise of stories from afar. Tales of temples built on marble cliffs, of cities where the air smells of spice and sea. The Celts were not mere recipients in this network. They were skilled traders, adaptive and innovative. Their settlements near trade crossings became vibrant centers of production. Archaeological finds at sites like Mosching in Germany reveal planned streets, workshops, and warehouses filled with imported amphorae. At Huneberg, near the upper Danube, archaeologists uncovered Mediterranean-style architecture. Plastered walls, tiled roofs, evidence of Celtic elites who admired and adopted foreign craft while maintaining native character. In these encounters, cultures mingled without conquest. A Greek pot might rest beside a Celtic drinking horn, each used in feasts where language mixed with laughter. The Celts learned new techniques, coinage, pottery styles, and artistic motifs, yet transformed them through their own lens of symbolism and motion. A vine scroll on a Greek vase became, in Celtic art, a swirling abstraction, less an image of nature than of its living essence. Trade also carried spiritual exchange. The Celts' reverence for water found kinship with Mediterranean cults of rivers and springs. Shared offerings, bronze figurines, jewelry, coins, were cast into lakes and streams as acts of gratitude. Commerce and worship intertwined, reminding the traveler that prosperity was not separate from faith. In these river valleys, wealth was measured not only in goods but in generosity. Feasting remained the currency of prestige. A chieftain's greatness lay in how widely he shared the fruits of trade. Imported wine became a symbol of hospitality, poured into handcrafted cups for guests who might have journeyed across mountains. To drink together was to weave trust, the most valuable commodity of all. Three calm discoveries define this world of movement. Trade as conversation. Every exchange was a dialogue between worlds, an act of curiosity as much as economy. Rivers as memory. The waterways carried more than goods. They bore the reflection of those who lived beside them. Merchants, poets, and children who never saw the sea, yet felt its pull through story and song. Connection as identity. The Celts remained distinct not by isolation but by transformation. Each encounter left a trace, absorbed and renewed within the spiral of their culture. The quiet rhythm of trade shaped their worldview. The Celts learned that movement could be sacred, that to follow a river's path was to follow the flow of time itself. In every journey downstream lay the promise of return, the circular dance that defined their philosophy of existence. As night falls along the Rhone, torches flicker on the docks. A merchant counts his goods by lamplight, his mind adrift with memories of faraway markets. Across the water, frogs sing softly, their chorus mingling with the whisper of oars. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Greek ships wait under the stars, their sails catching moonlight like silver leaves. Through these rivers, Europe was woven together long before the empires. The Celts, though often remembered as warriors, were first and foremost travelers. Bridges between north and south, between forest and sea. Their gift to history was not conquest, but connection. But trade did more than bring riches. It brought new ideas and new challenges. The same rivers that carried prosperity would soon carry omens of change. Across the blue horizon, new powers were stirring, disciplined, ambitious, and unfamiliar with the Celtic rhythm of freedom. The age of peaceful exchange was nearing its turning point. The Celts, once masters of the rivers, would soon meet those who sought to master the world. Long before the Celtic name became a legend whispered through Roman corridors, it was a word spoken by sailors, traders from the sunlit harbors of Massilia, who sailed north along the Rhone and returned with stories of tall, fair-haired peoples whose songs echoed across the forests. To the Greeks, they were Keltoi, a mysterious race beyond the edges of the known world, both alluring and untamed. Along the coastal hills of southern Gaul, these two worlds met. The Greeks brought amphorae filled with olive oil, wine, and ceramics painted in fine red slip. In return, Celtic merchants offered iron, salt, amber, and slaves. Goods that flowed like veins of wealth through the arteries of Europe. The encounter was quiet, cautious at first, yet transformative. The Celts observed the precision of Greek craftsmanship, the geometry of their temples, the ordered beauty of their markets. The Greeks, in turn, found a people who lived not by script or empire, but by rhythm and memory. This was a meeting of minds as much as goods, a slow recognition between two ways of being. Where the Greeks sought perfection in form, the Celts sought harmony in flow. Their art curved like rivers and vines, spiraling endlessly inward. Their speech, melodic and fluid, carried meaning not only in words but in cadence. Through trade and proximity, ideas began to pass between them, metalwork, motifs, and perhaps philosophies. In the uplands of Burgundy and the valleys of the Seine, Greek pottery began to appear in Celtic graves. The dead were laid to rest beside craters once filled with foreign wine, symbols of connection and prestige. The Celts drank deeply not only of the imported drink but of the concept, the notion of ceremony, of ritualized gathering, of dialogue. These influences mingled with their own customs, creating something new, a civilization still deeply rooted in its soil, yet touched by the wider world. In the archaeological layers of the Huneberg, an ancient Celtic hill fort overlooking the Danube, archaeologists uncovered fragments of Mediterranean pottery, tangible whispers of early globalization. Here, amid timber walls and thatched roofs, foreign vessels told of distant voices and shared ambitions. To the Mediterranean chroniclers, the Celts remained enigmatic. Herodotus wrote of them vaguely, placing them at the edges of geography, near the sources of great rivers. Later Greek writers described their fierceness, their eloquence, their freedom, qualities that both fascinated and unsettled the classical mind. For the Greeks, whose world revolved around the polis, the Celts' lack of urban boundaries seemed wild, almost philosophical. They lived close to nature, to weather, to spirit, a kind of liberty that defied the marble logic of Athens. From the Celtic side, the gaze was different. They saw the Southerners as bearers of beauty and craft, but also as people bound by stone and hierarchy. For them, the Greeks were another tribe, distant cousins who worshipped differently but shared the same sky. Their interactions remained limited yet meaningful, the first soft touch of two civilizations whose destinies would later intertwine more dramatically. On the shores near modern Vix, a burial mound held one of the most striking relics of this connection. The Vix crater, a monumental bronze vessel from the Mediterranean world, found in the tomb of a Celtic noblewoman. It stands taller than a person, its handles shaped like faces of the gods. Within that vessel lies a story of a woman who ruled in life, of trade that bridged cultures, and of a society far more sophisticated than outsiders imagined. As Greek traders withdrew and Roman power slowly expanded westward, new observers began to write about the Celts. Polybius, Livy, and later Caesar would describe them with equal parts admiration and fear. They were painted as bold, eloquent, impulsive, a people both noble and dangerous. Yet behind these accounts lies another truth, that the Celts themselves were also watching, adapting, learning. They did not vanish into the written words of others. They absorbed the encounter, letting it ripple through their own evolution. Trade became a mirror. In it, they saw not only the glitter of bronze and wine, but reflections of themselves, what it meant to be free, to belong, to change. Their bards wove new songs about the southern cities, songs that spoke of stone temples and endless seas. Through these tales, the idea of the world widened. By the 4th century BCE, the Celts had become more than a network of tribes. They were a cultural constellation. Their art, the Latin style, began to bloom fully, influenced in part by Mediterranean forms yet unmistakably their own. Swords were inlaid with coral, jewelry twisted into flowing spirals, shields engraved with patterns that seemed to move under the eye. It was as though the Celts had seen the order of Greece and responded not with imitation, but with motion, an art that breathed rather than stood still. Many Latin artifacts reveal traces of coral from the Mediterranean, iron from the north, and gold from riverbeds deep inland. a synthesis of materials that mirrors their cultural blending. In each object, trade becomes poetry, geography becomes design. To the Greeks and Romans, the Celts' freedom of spirit remained their most defining trait. They fought without rigid formation, governed without codified law, and spoke with a passion that struck awe into foreign diplomats. Yet beneath this freedom lay a discipline of another kind, one of loyalty, oral memory, and respect for balance. As the classical world grew more defined, the Celts' world remained fluid, a contrast that would soon lead to friction. When the Romans came, they would see not merchants or artists, but warriors at their borders. But in these earlier centuries, before conquest and resistance, the relationship was one of curiosity. Two cultures circling each other in admiration and mystery. And so, as the sun set over the Rhone, its light reflected off the traded goods. Amphorae stacked in quiet ports, swords resting by fires, melodies carried by river wind. The Celts and the Greeks shared something timeless. The desire to understand the world through creation, through exchange, through story. As they met the empires of the south, the Celts also turned east and west toward migration and the unknown. The rivers that once carried trade would soon carry people, dreams, and destinies. Across mountains, into the heart of new lands, where their legacy would take root once more. In the quiet centuries that followed their first contact with the Mediterranean world, the Celts began to move, not as conquerors at first but as seekers. Across the vast forests and river plains of Central Europe, their numbers grew, their ambitions widened, and their paths began to cross the high passes of the Alps. It began gradually, with small tribes following trade routes southward. The roads carved by merchants became arteries for migration, carrying families, warriors, and dreams. The Alps, shimmering under snow and mist, did not stop them. They crossed in waves, their wagons creaking, their songs echoing against the stone. At night, fires flickered on the slopes like constellations fallen to earth. When they descended into the northern plains of Italy, they found lands fertile and rich, dotted with Etruscan cities and open fields. These valleys of the Po River, warm, green, and threaded with rivers, must have seemed like a promise fulfilled. They built settlements there, blending with or displacing earlier peoples, their presence spreading like water through open channels. But in this meeting of worlds, peace was short-lived. The Etruscans resisted. Their cities were strong and proud. The Celts, fierce and swift, struck with the energy of newcomers who had known long journeys. Towns fell, borders shifted, and soon, the southern lands trembled with news of a people who came from beyond the mountains, the Gauls, as the Romans would call them. The Romans, still a young republic then, watched uneasily as reports arrived of these northern tribes. At first, the encounters were scattered and uncertain, small clashes on the edges of Etruscan influence. But in time, the storm gathered strength. Around 390 BCE, it broke upon Rome itself. The Cernunnos, a Celtic tribe led by Brennus, marched toward the city after disputes with the neighboring town of Clusium. Rome, seeking to defend its ally, sent an army north, one that would soon be broken. At the river Allia, the Roman legions met the Celts in open battle. The clash was brief, almost abrupt in its ferocity. The Celts, larger in number and momentum, swept through the Roman lines. The army dissolved, the defense of the city collapsed, and within days, the invaders stood before Rome's gates. The sack that followed entered legend. Fire, confusion, the echo of hooves in deserted streets, all of it carved deeply into Roman memory. Yet even here, amid destruction, the story carries a quiet strangeness. The Celts did not occupy or seek to rule. They took what they desired, gold and goods, and left. Their presence was like a storm, sudden, magnificent, terrifying, and then gone, leaving silence in its wake. For the Romans, this event was a scar that never faded. For centuries afterward, the word Gallus carried the weight of that fear, a memory of vulnerability, of the time the eternal city was humbled. But for the Celts, the story was different. The march into Italy was not a single invasion but part of a great movement. Families and tribes seeking new lands, guided less by conquest than by the quiet impulse to expand, to wander, to begin again. As they settled in the Po Valley and beyond, they founded new towns Mediolanum, modern Milan, Bononia, Bologna, and others, places that would later become cornerstones of Italian civilization. Their influence blended with the soil. They adopted new tools, new words, new gods, even as they carried their old beliefs forward. In these valleys, Celtic farmers plowed Italian fields, their children speaking tongues that mixed northern and southern rhythms. Blacksmiths forged weapons in workshops once Etruscan, blending designs. In this mingling, one can sense the quiet merging of two worlds, the forest and the vineyard, the bronze and the iron, the tribal and the civic. The Romans would return in time, stronger and more disciplined, to reclaim what had been lost. But for now, in this early age, the Celts held sway. Their presence stretched across northern Italy like the calm after rain, still, reflective, and full of quiet transformation. Through these migrations, the Celts revealed something essential about their nature. They were not bound by place, but by spirit. Their identity was a living current, flowing through generations and landscapes. Wherever they went, they carried the same deep connection to story, to craft, to kinship. The sack of Rome became, in the long rhythm of their history, not an act of cruelty, but a moment of contact, a meeting of two destinies that would one day define Europe. In the centuries ahead, Rome would grow into empire, and the Celts would become both its adversaries and its teachers, leaving behind artistry, myth, and courage that even conquest could not erase. And so the story of the Celts crossing the Alps is not one of violence alone, but of movement, a migration shaped by curiosity, survival, and the endless search for belonging. The same mountains they once crossed in daring would, in time, stand as silent witnesses to their passing, to the echo of their footsteps, to the memory of their fires, to the dreams that led them south beneath an ancient sky. But not all moved south. Some crossed the western seas, seeking new worlds in the mist. As the Alps faded behind them, new horizons called from across the waters, where other tribes would carry the Celtic heart into distant lands, and new stories would begin to take shape beneath the rain and stone of forgotten isles. Across the silver waters that separated the continent from the misty shores of the northwest, the Celts found new lands waiting, Britain and Ireland, lands of forests, rivers, and endless sky. The crossings began quietly, in scattered generations, long before history wrote their names. By the first millennium BCE, Celtic speech and spirit had taken root in the islands. Here, far from the bustle of the Mediterranean and the ambitions of empires, the old culture transformed into something both familiar and new. The isles welcomed them not with marble cities but with stone and storm. Hills rolled like sleeping beasts beneath drifting clouds. Rivers wound through ancient woodlands, and the sea was a constant whisper, shaping every life it touched. The people who came here, the ancestors of later Britons, Gaels, and Picts, lived close to that rhythm. They built small round houses from timber and clay, warmed by central hearths whose smoke curled through thatched roofs into the night. In this world, the sacred and the ordinary intertwined. Every tree, every spring, every hill carried meaning. The Celts brought their gods with them, but in the Isles those gods took on new faces. The old continental deities of thunder and sun merged with local spirits of water and stone. Shrines appeared beside lakes and rivers, offerings cast into the depths. Torques, swords, and coins, given not from fear, but reverence. These were lands that taught the Celts to listen. Stone circles that had stood for millennia, silent relics of an even older age, gained new voices. The newcomers did not destroy them. They reinterpreted them. Rituals of renewal and passage unfolded beneath those monoliths, aligning the cycles of life with the motions of the heavens. The Celts saw no divide between the living and the departed, the divine and the earthly. To them, time was a wheel, endlessly turning, and each generation a spoke within it. In these isles, the Druids came into prominence, guardians of memory, lore, and spiritual law. They were teachers, poets, and judges, trained for decades in oral tradition. To stand before a Druid was to face living history. They taught that words themselves had power, that truth carried a rhythm like a river's flow, and that to speak falsely disrupted the harmony of the world. It was through them that the Celtic soul deepened, contemplative, reverent, and rooted in story. While the Roman world measured time in calendars and battles, the Celts of Britain and Ireland measured it in seasons and songs. Their festivals, Beltane, Samhain, Lugnasad, and Imbolc, marked not only the turning of the year but the eternal dialogue between light and dark, life and rest. Fires burned on hilltops as communities gathered, their laughter blending with the night wind. For them, existence was not a straight line but a circle of renewal. Kings rose among the oak groves, ruling small territories bound more by loyalty and kinship than by written decree. Each realm was both political and sacred, its ruler believed to carry the land's fortune within himself. If the harvest failed, it was not merely misfortune but imbalance, a reminder that the bond between king, people, and earth required constant tending. The Druidic councils advised, the bards recorded, and the craftsmen created, weaving together a society sustained as much by spirit as by strength. The Isles' isolation allowed these traditions to evolve freely. In Ireland, myth began to crystallize into story. Tales of gods who were once heroes, of the Tuatha De Dan and descending in clouds and mist, of great battles fought not for territory, but for balance. In Britain, ancestral figures such as Brigid, Lugh, and Epona took hold, their names echoing across regions and centuries. These myths were not escapes from reality, but reflections of it, mirrors through which people understood their place within an enchanted world. Trade and travel continued across the narrow seas, linking island Celts with their continental kin. Bronze mirrors and gold ornaments crossed the waters, carrying familiar artistry and design. Yet with each generation, the Isles' identity grew more distinct. Their languages, early forms of what would become Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton, sang with softer cadence, as though shaped by wind and rain. The life of an island Celt was one of intimate balance. Days were filled with work, herding cattle, tilling soil, crafting tools, but beneath it all ran an undercurrent of ritual awareness. Even the act of planting or forging was seen as participation in a cosmic cycle. They did not separate the sacred from the simple. They lived within it. The night skies of Ireland and Britain must have been extraordinary. Vast, unpolluted, and alive with stars. To those who lived then, each constellation told a story, each rising moon a reminder that the world breathed with them. Around hearths, elders recited lineages that traced back not just to heroes, but to the land itself. They believed that to forget was to diminish the world, and so they remembered endlessly. As centuries passed, the insular Celts began to diverge fully from their continental relatives. Their societies became less tribal and more regional, yet their core remained the same: reverence for nature, mastery of craft, and devotion to oral wisdom. The iron blades they forged gleamed like reflections of the moon, their jewelry coiled in shapes that echoed the eternal spirals of their cosmology. When the Romans eventually came to Britain, they found a land of many small kingdoms and a people rich in spirit. Though their chronicles described them as wild, the truth was quieter. These were communities deeply connected to their environment, whose strength lay not in empire but in endurance. In Ireland, untouched by Roman conquest, the old traditions endured even longer, preserved in mythic memory. The Celts of the Isles did not build monuments of marble or leave long inscriptions, yet they built something else, an inheritance of language, poetry, and imagination. From their worldview would later emerge the stories that inspired generations: Arthurian legends, bardic poems, and the enduring sense that the land itself holds wisdom. Their journey across the sea was not simply a migration of bodies, but of belief, a continuation of the ancient Celtic instinct to seek, to adapt, to belong without possessing. In the mists of Britain and the green silence of Ireland, the Celtic spirit found a home that would outlast kingdoms and conquests alike. In these western lands, the Celts found not only homes, but horizons of faith and mystery. Here, beneath the whispering oaks and the eternal sky, their culture would take on new shapes, and from this stillness, a deeper form of spirituality would rise, one that would define their world for centuries to come. There was a time when faith did not dwell in temples or scrolls, but in the living breath of the world itself. For the Celts, divinity was not distant. It was present in the rustle of oak leaves, in the mist that rolled across the rivers, in the quiet birth and death of each season. Their gods were not confined to heaven, nor their spirits to stone. Both walked freely through field and forest. Across the Celtic world, sacred groves stood like natural cathedrals. No walls, no altars, only trees rising into endless sky. Here the Druids gathered. They were priests but also judges, healers, and philosophers, the mind of their people and the voice of balance. Under moonlight or morning mist, they performed their rites, speaking words never written, known only through memory and breath. Their wisdom was not kept in books, but in generations of disciplined recall, each apprentice learning the sacred verses that told of creation, law, and the turning of the world. For the Celts, the universe was woven in threes, a pattern of harmony seen everywhere. Land, sea, and sky formed the triad of existence. Body, mind, and spirit reflected the same. Even the gods often appeared in threes, their powers interlacing like strands of a braid. This triadic vision was more than belief. It was a way of perceiving order amid chaos. Every storm, every harvest, every birth and burial belonged to this vast rhythm of threes, in which all things held purpose and place. To live as a Celt was to dwell within that sacred order. Fields were not merely worked, they were blessed. Rivers were not crossed without tribute, for each carried its own consciousness, its own will. Offerings were given, gold jewelry, crafted weapons, carved figures, not to appease, but to communicate. To throw a sword into a lake was not to discard it, but to return its spirit to the element from which it was born. The Druids stood at the center of this cosmic balance. They interpreted omens, settled disputes, and served as intermediaries between people and gods. Theirs was not a faith of fear, but of understanding, that nature's forces, though vast, were kin to humanity. In their ceremonies, mistletoe was cut with golden sickles, animals were offered in symbolic exchange, and prayers were spoken in low, rhythmic tones. It was said that the Druids knew the language of trees, that they could read the secrets carried by birds in flight. Yet, beyond ritual, their true strength lay in thought. Ancient writers like Caesar and Strabo spoke of them as philosophers, teaching that the soul did not die but returned in endless cycles, rebirth through time and matter. To the Celtic mind, death was not an ending, but a continuation in another form. This belief gave them courage in battle and serenity in grief. To fall in war was to pass through the veil and begin again. Every hill, every spring, every grove was a meeting point between worlds. Spirits of ancestors lingered not in shadows, but in sunlight and air. The living and the dead were never far apart. They shared the same realm, separated only by the gentlest of veils. At certain times of year, at Samhain and Beltane, that veil was believed to thin, allowing communion across realms. Fires were lit, songs were sung, and the people felt their lineage close around them like a cloak. Unlike the great stone temples of Egypt or Greece, the Celts built their sanctuaries in open space, places where nature itself could speak. Some sites were marked by wooden posts or simple circles of earth. Others, like the sanctuaries at Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribe-Mont-sur-Ancre, held offerings of weapons and bones, gifts to gods of war and fertility, symbols of life's dual currents. Even where blood was shed, the act was understood as part of the eternal exchange between destruction and renewal. In their myths, the gods reflected human emotion yet transcended it. There was Danube, the mother of rivers and life; Lugh, the radiant one, master of every art; and Brigid, whose flame burned through craft and healing. To the Celts, gods were not remote rulers, but expressions of the forces they lived among. They were companions, protectors, and reminders that divinity was woven through every moment of existence. Daily life mirrored this sacred understanding. A blacksmith's forge was as holy as a druid's grove, for in both transformation occurred, or to blade, thought to wisdom. Farmers traced circles in the soil as they planted, invoking cycles of growth. Mothers whispered blessings to newborns drawn from ancient songs. In every act, there was awareness of belonging, of being part of a living, breathing world where nothing stood alone. This spirituality required no conversion, no creed. It was lived through rhythm and respect. To harm nature without purpose was to wound oneself. To forget one's ancestors was to lose the roots of being. Their faith was less a doctrine than a relationship, an ongoing dialogue between human life and the unseen patterns that held it together. And when storms came, when rivers flooded or lightning struck trees, the Celts did not curse their gods. They listened. Nature's tempests were not punishments but voices, reminders that power and fragility were inseparable. To live rightly was to live in harmony with that truth. Such a worldview bred both humility and wonder. It taught that the same force that stirred the ocean's tide also stirred the human heart. That the oak and the soul grew by the same law. That to walk upon the earth was, in itself, an act of reverence. As centuries passed and foreign faiths arrived, the sacred order of the Celts would begin to fade from the visible world. Yet its echoes endured, in the myths of later generations, in the reverence for nature that survived beneath new names, in the quiet intuition that spirit and matter are not separate but one. From their gods, the Celts drew not only belief but the rhythm of their societies. The same harmony that bound grove and sky would soon shape their laws, their hierarchies, and their daily lives, forming a civilization that breathed through both order and imagination. Every fire lit on a hill carried a prayer, for harvest, for light, for the turning of the year. Among the Celts, ritual was not a performance for the divine but a conversation with the universe, one in which humanity, nature, and spirit spoke in harmony. The rhythm of their ceremonies matched the rhythm of the earth itself. Sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, birth and decay. In a world without clocks or cathedrals, time was measured in the flicker of flame, the rise of stars, and the change of wind. The Celtic calendar was a living circle, not a line. Its great festivals marked the thresholds between seasons, those liminal moments when the veil between worlds grew thin and meaning shimmered just beyond sight. Of these, 4 stood at the heart of their year: Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugh. Each carried its own spirit, its own song, and its own prayer to the unseen. Samhain, the festival of endings and beginnings, came as autumn's light faded. It was a time when the boundary between the living and the dead grew soft. Fires were kindled not to frighten but to guide, gentle beacons for wandering souls returning home. Families placed food and drink upon their thresholds, offerings to ancestors whose wisdom still shaped the present. To the Celts, death was not a rupture but a turning. One spoke on the wheel of existence. And so, in this season of quiet, they honored the cycle by remembering. As winter waned, Imbolc arrived with its promise of renewal. It was sacred to Brigid, goddess of poetry, craft, and the hearth. In the cold fields, offerings of milk and woven rush crosses were laid to welcome her blessing. Fires burned again, not for protection but for inspiration. Brigid's festival reminded the Celts that creation was not confined to artisans and poets. It lived in every act of tending, every effort to bring warmth and beauty to the world. With the coming of May, Beltane ignited the landscape. Fires leapt high on the hills, their glow seen for miles. Cattle were driven between twin flames to ensure health and fertility. Lovers leapt across embers for luck and union. It was a celebration of life in its fullness, the joy of green returning, of earth renewed. In the flicker of Beltane's light, the Celts saw not only passion but balance. The meeting of forces, masculine and feminine, sky and soil, spirit and flesh. And then, in the height of summer, came Lugnasad, the festival of the harvest. Named for Lugh, the bright god of skill, it was both a tribute and a thanksgiving. The first grains were cut, the first loaves baked. Feasts and games followed, contests of poetry, craft, and strength, echoing Lugh's own mastery of all arts. To celebrate was to participate in the divine cycle, to acknowledge that work and joy, effort and reward, were sacred twins. Through these rituals, the Celts expressed not merely faith but belonging. Their ceremonies united the individual with the tribe with the land, and the land with the unseen world. Even today, faint echoes of these festivals endure. In autumn bonfires, spring gatherings, midsummer dances, the modern shadows of ancient fires once lit beneath starlit skies. Symbols, too, carried power. The spiral was among the oldest, carved into stone long before the written word. It represented life's eternal motion, inward toward reflection, outward toward growth, never static, always becoming. The triple spiral, or triskele, echoed this principle in harmony with the Celtic love of triads. To the spiritual mind, it suggested body, mind, and soul, land, sea, and sky, or past, present, and future, three aspects of a single truth turning in balance. The knotwork patterns that adorn jewelry, weapons, and manuscripts centuries later stemmed from this same understanding. Each line weaves into another without end or break, the visual embodiment of continuity and connection. To trace such a knot was to meditate upon life's interwoven threads. How joy and sorrow, birth and loss, beginning and end, were all part of one great design. Animals, too, served as symbols of power and guidance. The boar stood for courage and strength, the stag for sovereignty and the untamed spirit of the forest. The horse, swift and enduring, symbolized motion between worlds, often associated with the goddess Epona, guardian of travelers and the cycle of life. Birds, especially ravens and swans, bridged the earthly and spiritual realms, their flight an image of freedom and transition. Every gesture, every carving, every object held meaning. The Celts did not separate art from ritual or symbol from function. A sword might bear sacred markings not for vanity, but to invoke protection. A brooch's pattern might honor a goddess or recall a lineage. Even the arrangement of dwellings reflected cosmic principles, circles within circles, mirroring the wheel of time and the sun's journey across the heavens. Ritual, for them, was not confined to grand occasions. It infused daily life, the lighting of a hearth, the sharing of food, the pouring of libations before a journey. The ordinary was made sacred through intention. Each act of care or gratitude was a reaffirmation of the great pattern that bound all things. To live mindfully was, in essence, to live religiously. It is easy, in modern imagination, to romanticize these customs, to see them through myth and legend. But beneath the poetry was practicality. The festivals regulated agriculture, the rituals maintained social order, and the symbols preserved knowledge. They were, at once, spiritual and structural systems that bound the community through shared rhythm and belief. In a world without written scripture, memory became their scripture. The bards and druids carried stories and verses that encoded these traditions, songs that taught ethics, cosmology, and craft through metaphor. In them, ritual and language intertwined. The spoken word was itself a rite, its cadence believed to echo the harmony of creation. When the Romans and later the Christians came, many of these customs were absorbed or transformed rather than destroyed. Samhain became All Hallows, Imbolc merged with Candlemas. Brigid the goddess became Saint Brigid. Yet the underlying reverence for cycles, for connection, for the quiet holiness of nature endured. Even in new faiths, the old rhythm remained. And so, when we look back upon Celtic ritual and symbol, what we see is not superstition, but a coherent worldview, one that found meaning in relationship rather than domination. Fire was not worshipped as a god but recognized as kin. The earth was not possessed but partnered. Every act of offering was a gesture of reciprocity, an acknowledgement that life is a shared creation. For the Celts, the world was alive, not metaphorically but truly. The breath of God stirred in the wind, the pulse of ancestors beat in the rain, and in every flame, the mystery of existence danced anew. As their rituals bound them together, so too did their leaders bind their people to land and loyalty. From the sacred firelight of their ceremonies would rise the figures of kings and chieftains, rulers who embodied not domination, but duty, and whose strength reflected the spirit of their tribes. In the glow of firelight, power was not decreed, it was sung into being. Among the Celts, leadership was not an inheritance carved in stone, but a living pact, renewed each season, tested each harvest, remembered through song. Kings, chieftains, and elders rose not by divine right but by respect. The trust of their people, the strength of their word, and the weight of their generosity. Authority flowed not downward, but outward, like the spreading warmth of a hearth. Each clan or tuath was a small kingdom unto itself, a network of families bound by kinship, tradition, and shared land. To belong was to be woven into something greater. The field you tilled, the cattle you tended, the stories you inherited. Power was not abstract. It was felt in the soil, the feast, the judgment. The leader stood at the center of this web, not as a master, but as a thread among threads, responsible for holding them together when storms came. The Celtic king, or Ree, was chosen through a system that prized consensus and merit as much as lineage. While noble blood mattered, so too did wisdom, eloquence, and the ability to inspire loyalty. A good ruler had to be both warrior and poet, strategist and judge. One who could defend the tribe in battle yet also settle disputes beneath the oak's shade. Kingship was a sacred contract, symbolized by the phase, the ritual of inauguration, where the new leader pledged harmony with the land and its people. To rule justly was to rule in balance with the natural world. The king's health was tied to the fertility of his territory, a reflection of the belief that cosmic and human order were one. If crops failed or injustice spread, it was said that the king had broken his harmony with the land. In such a world, morality was not written in law but lived in relationship. Leadership demanded not conquest but care. Around him, a council of nobles and druids advised and restrained his power. Druids, those keepers of wisdom, were more than priests. They were judges, philosophers, and mediators between the human and the divine. Their word carried great weight, for they spoke with the authority of memory, the long memory of oral tradition that linked each tribe to its ancestors and gods. In times of crisis, it was the druids who counseled patience, and the poets who preserved the truth when swords could not. The warrior class formed another pillar of this order. To the Celts, valor was not cruelty, but a form of virtue, courage in defense of kin, honor, and freedom. Warriors swore oaths not to empires, but to leaders they believed embodied fairness and strength. Feasts after battle were sacred occasions, where tales of bravery were recited and reputations forged anew. In these moments, society remembered its ideals, that courage meant loyalty and strength meant service. At the heart of every hall sat the bard, the voice of memory, the keeper of truth. Through verse and melody, the bard transformed events into meaning. Kings might fall, empires might burn, but a song endured. To be praised by a bard was to be immortalized. To be scorned was to fade into silence. Their art was power, subtle yet lasting. In this way, poetry acted as a moral compass, reminding rulers that legacy was earned not through wealth or war, but through justice and wisdom. The feast was more than a gathering. It was the stage upon which leadership revealed itself. Beneath timbered roofs, with torches casting golden light upon bronze and linen, the tribe assembled. The distribution of meat, the order of seating, even the toasts carried symbolic weight. Generosity was a sacred duty. To give was to affirm one's place within the fabric of the clan. A leader's honor depended not only on his victories, but on his hospitality. Laws, too, were deeply personal, rooted in community and memory rather than written decree. The Brehon laws of later centuries preserved echoes of this ancient order. Justice that sought restoration over punishment and balance over vengeance. Compensation, rather than cruelty, mended the social web. Each case acknowledged that every wrong was a tear in the communal fabric, one that must be repaired with care and fairness. In such a world, wealth was measured not in coin, but in cattle, land, and reputation. A noble might own herds and hillforts, but his worth lay in how many lives his generosity touched. The Celts admired abundance not as possession, but as potential, the ability to nourish others. To hoard was dishonor. To give was greatness. Women, too, held influence within this framework. Queens and noblewomen could own property, lead warriors, and even act as judges or diplomats. Figures like Boudica of the Iceni and Medb of Connaught, though emerging later in history, reflect an enduring tradition of female leadership woven into the Celtic worldview. Gender did not define worth, character did. Leadership, in its purest form, was simply the ability to bind hearts and sustain harmony. The web of Celtic society was flexible yet strong. Each person, from farmer to druid, played a part in maintaining its rhythm. The absence of centralized rule, so perplexing to Roman chroniclers, was not weakness but resilience. Decentralization allowed freedom, creativity, and adaptation. When one tribe faltered, another endured. Power was not a fortress, but a forest. Many roots, many branches, all feeding from the same earth. It was a society built on trust, song, and shared memory. In the stillness after a feast, when the fires dimmed and the stars emerged above the thatched roofs, one might hear a bard's voice rise, soft, slow, carrying the story of a king's justice or a warrior's loyalty. The people listened, not merely for entertainment, but to remember who they were. Each verse was a reminder that to live well was to live together. As the centuries passed, this web would stretch and strain under the weight of ambition and external threat. Some leaders would seek greater glory, uniting clans under banners of conquest. Others would cling to tradition, choosing harmony over expansion. The balance between freedom and unity, so delicately maintained, began to tremble. Yet even harmony has its dissonance, and in time ambition would lead to conflict. For in the same fire that warmed the tribe, there also glowed the spark of rivalry, a force that would shape the coming age of heroes and wars among kin. For the Celtic warrior, every battle was a poem written in steel and silence. To fight was not merely to destroy, but to affirm life, to prove courage, loyalty, and spirit beneath the eyes of the gods. In a world without standing armies or empires of uniform discipline, warfare was deeply human, intimate, ritualized, and suffused with meaning. The Celts saw conflict not as endless conquest, but as a sacred test of balance, of strength against strength, of destiny against fate. In the mornings before battle, the world held its breath. Mist curled over rivers and plains, and warriors painted their bodies with spirals and beasts. Ancient symbols meant to confuse spirits and embolden hearts. Faces shone with lime-washed hair, spiked and wild beneath the rising sun. Bronze and iron glimmered on shields, not in polished perfection, but in the honest wear of use. A warrior's gear was an extension of himself, sword, shield, and chariot forming a trinity of identity, each imbued with spiritual essence. Their swords were leaf-shaped, broad, double-edged, beautifully balanced for close combat. To the Celts, the sword was not a tool of death but a companion of destiny. Warriors named their blades and decorated them with enamel and gold, carrying them into battle as one might carry a soul. When a warrior died, his sword was bent and placed in water, a final offering to the divine, returning iron to the earth's deep silence. The chariot, too, was a marvel of Celtic craft. Sleek and light, drawn by 2 horses, it was the vehicle of heroes. Warriors rode not to mow down their foes, but to move with grace and speed, dismounting to fight on foot, then leaping back to ride again. The sound of their wheels, creaking and ringing over uneven fields, was said to echo like thunder. To the Romans and Greeks who watched them, the sight was both beautiful and terrifying. A dance of metal and muscle, charged with mythic energy. Celtic warfare was as much ceremony as chaos. Before combat, champions might step forward between the armies, not to slaughter but to challenge, to test the courage of the foe. These duels were moments of profound symbolism. The tribe's honor condensed into two lives, one heartbeat against another. Each swing of the sword, each cry, was a verse in a greater story. A story of identity and pride, of bravery that transcended fear. The warriors themselves were not soldiers of a state. They were members of clans, bound by oaths of loyalty and kinship. A man's worth was measured not by what he conquered, but by the honor with which he fought. Boasting, to the Celts, was not arrogance but ritual, a verbal promise to the gods that one would not falter. Cowardice was a sin not because it endangered others, but because it broke faith with one's own spirit. Yet this valor was not unrestrained. Even in war, there were boundaries, unwritten yet sacred. Druids and elders sometimes mediated disputes before blood was shed. Truces were honored during religious festivals. Warfare followed the rhythm of the seasons, for to fight during harvest or midwinter was to offend both nature and the gods. Battle, like every act of the Celts, was woven into the greater pattern of life, neither glorified nor shunned, but accepted as a part of existence's circle. Across Europe, Celtic tribes developed reputations as fierce and indomitable. Their raids on Etruria and Rome, their clashes with Macedonians and Greeks, echoed across centuries. And yet, behind every story of ferocity lay a quieter truth, that these were people who valued freedom above dominion. They fought not to rule, but to remain unruled. The Celts' resistance to central authority, which confounded their enemies, was born of a belief that the spirit must never be caged. Their armor reflected this philosophy. Some fought naked, trusting in the protection of courage and faith alone. Others were chainmail, a Celtic invention later adopted by the Romans, or helmets adorned with animal motifs. Boars, birds, and horns representing strength, vision, and spiritual power. Shields, often round or oval, bore patterns of flowing lines, never rigid or symmetrical, art that mirrored the living pulse of the warrior's heart. To face death in battle was not tragedy, but transformation. Warriors believed the soul endured beyond the body, that courage in life ensured peace in the next world. This faith infused combat with calm resolve. Death was not the end, but a passage. Songs told of heroes who crossed to the other world through battle, greeted not by grief, but by eternal feasting among ancestors. To die with honor was to return to the circle, to become part of the rhythm that governed sky, soil, and soul. After battle, the Celts did not celebrate destruction. They honored the fallen, friend and foe alike, with solemn rites. Weapons were cast into lakes and rivers, hilltops and bogs became sacred ground. Archaeologists have uncovered these offerings. Swords deliberately bent, shields folded, chariots dismantled, each an act of reverence, returning the instruments of war to the world that had given them. The still waters of Europe hold thousands of such memories, shimmering echoes of a people who believed that even in death, balance must be restored. In the long peace between wars, warriors became protectors. They guarded herds, oversaw feasts, upheld justice, and ensured that no hunger or cruelty threatened the tribe. Their strength was channeled into service. To be a warrior was to live for others, a paradox of gentleness wrapped in iron. The same hand that wielded a sword could also cradle a child or guide a plow. Over time, this warrior ethos became woven into Celtic art and myth. The hero Cu Chulainn of Ulster, for instance, was revered not only for his skill in battle, but for his loyalty and tragedy, the embodiment of courage bound by fate. Such tales reminded listeners that greatness was never without cost. Valor was only noble when tempered by compassion. When foreign chroniclers, Greek and Roman alike, described the Celts as reckless or savage, they saw only the surface of a culture that fought not for plunder, but for principle. Beneath the noise of battle was an inner stillness, the calm of men and women who understood that life was fleeting, but honor endured. In that understanding, there was serenity, even amid blood and fire. And so, under shifting skies and the scent of iron and earth, the Celtic warrior lived and died by a simple creed. Courage above fear, truth above victory, freedom above all. As swords sang across the plains and chariots rolled to rest, the Celts turned inward once more, seeking wisdom beyond war. For in the stillness that follows battle, a quieter power awaited, the realm of the Druids and the sacred groves of knowledge. When the legions came, the forests of Gaul whispered with unease. In the year 58 BCE, the slow rhythm of Celtic life, its fields, feasts, and sacred groves, began to tremble beneath the march of Rome. Julius Caesar, seeking glory, crossed the Alps with disciplined armies and iron ambition. Before him stretched the lands of countless tribes. The Aedui, Arverni, Helvetii, and dozens more, each with their own kings, customs, and gods, yet bound by the unspoken kinship of being Gauls. It was here that freedom and empire first met in fateful contest. To the Celts, the land was not territory but belonging, an inheritance of spirit. To Rome, it was conquest, a name to be added to the map of dominion. Caesar saw in Gaul both opportunity and chaos, a patchwork of rival tribes, divided by pride and old grudges. Through diplomacy and force, he moved like a tide, offering alliance to some, destruction to others. The Helvetii were the first to fall, their migration halted and scattered. Yet as the smoke of battle rose, so too did a deeper realization among the Gauls, that their way of life was being tested as never before. The Gallic Wars were not a single conflict, but a storm of years. Campaigns fought across rivers and forests, valleys and hillforts. The legions, precise and methodical, built roads and fortresses as they advanced, reshaping the landscape itself. The Celts fought with ferocity, charging with wild cries, their courage unmatched. Yet Rome's discipline was relentless, its strategies patient. Each victory for Caesar was measured not only in land gained but in order imposed upon freedom. Out of this turmoil rose a name that would live forever in memory: Vercingetorix. Born of the Arverni, he was both warrior and statesman, a leader who understood that only unity could save his people. Where others saw tribes, he saw a nation, not one of empire but of shared spirit. His voice carried through the valleys of central Gaul, calling chieftains to stand together against the invader. For a brief, bright moment they did. In 52 BCE, Gaul rose as one. Villages that had once traded and fought with one another now joined in a single cause, to reclaim their freedom. The Romans called them barbarians. Yet in their courage and coordination, they revealed a profound civilization of purpose. Vercingetorix led with wisdom and restraint, scorched the land before Caesar, denying his army food and shelter. The Celts fought not for conquest but for endurance, seeking to outlast the empire's hunger. The struggle came to its solemn climax at Alesia. There, on a hilltop surrounded by rivers and plains, Vercingetorix and his army faced the full might of Rome. Caesar's legions, methodical as clockwork, encircled the fortress with walls upon walls, a cage of earth and timber. For weeks, the Celts held out, watching as hunger and exhaustion crept among them. Outside, relief forces gathered, hundreds of thousands of Gauls coming to break the siege. For a moment, hope flickered like fire in the night, but fate, as always, was indifferent. The relief force failed to break through, and the defenders within were starved into silence. Vercingetorix, proud and unbroken, rode out from the gates, clad in his finest armor, and surrendered himself to Caesar. He did not beg. He did not kneel. He offered himself as the price of his people's survival. Ancient writers tell of how he cast his weapons at Caesar's feet, a gesture both defiant and dignified, marking the end of freedom, yet not its spirit. In that moment, Gaul was lost. Yet something deeper endured, a collective memory, carried in story and soil. The Celts had faced the greatest power of the age, and though defeated, they were not erased. Their language, art, and reverence for nature survived, hidden in the hearts of the people. Rome could conquer the body, but not the dream of freedom. For Caesar, victory brought triumph, processions through the marble streets of Rome, his name forever bound to conquest. But for the Gauls it brought silence. Hill forts that had once echoed with feasts now stood empty. The Druids, the keepers of wisdom, retreated into secrecy, their sacred groves destroyed or forgotten. Yet even in defeat, the Celtic spirit found ways to endure. The Roman world absorbed Celtic lands, but in doing so, it also absorbed something of their soul, their art, their craftsmanship, their sense of balance with the natural world. Among the ruins of Gaul, one could still find quiet moments of continuity. Farmers tended fields where battles had raged. Children learned old songs beside Roman roads. Stone carvings of Celtic gods stood beside temples of Jupiter, their features softened but unbroken. The conquerors might claim victory, but the conquered taught them beauty. The Celts became the invisible pulse beneath the empire's grandeur, the whisper of the old world beneath new marble. To those who listen, that whisper remains. It tells of courage that was not lost, only changed. Of people who faced empire and found dignity even in surrender. The story of Gaul is not one of defeat, but of transformation, the merging of two great forces of history, whose tension shaped Europe for centuries to come. As the fires of war dimmed and Caesar returned to Rome, the forests of Gaul grew quiet once more. Yet beneath their silence lay memory, of drums, of songs, of the voices that had once risen to defy the empire. The wind that moved through those trees carried more than air. It carried remembrance. Yet beyond the reach of Rome's eagles, across the gray waters to the west, another Celtic world endured, untouched for a while longer, waiting beneath mist and rain. There, on the edges of the known world, the old spirit took root again, in the green isles of Britain and the highlands of the north. On distant shores, where the Atlantic winds curl over cliffs and sweep across green hills, the old Celtic spirit endured. While Rome extended its grasp across Gaul and the continent, the islands to the northwest remained largely untouched. Britain and Ireland became sanctuaries, preserving the language, laws, and beliefs that had begun on continental plains. Here, the rhythm of life followed the land and sky rather than the dictates of empire, and the Celts continued to live in accordance with patterns older than any written word. In Britain, the memory of resistance became legend. The Iceni Queen Boudica rose in rebellion around 60 CE, challenging Roman occupation with a force born of courage and outrage. Her armies burned towns and fought with ferocity, yet even as the revolt was crushed, her story was carried forward by song and oral tradition. To the Celts, she was not merely a military leader, but a symbol of endurance, proof that their spirit could survive beyond the walls of empire and the weight of conquest. Ireland, shielded by the sea, retained even more of its independence. Its people lived in small kingdoms, their society structured around kinship, druids, and bards. Hill forts dotted the landscape, not as fortresses of war but as centers of governance and ceremony. Oral law guided communities, and storytelling preserved the wisdom of generations. Here, the sacred order remained vivid, shaping lives with the subtle authority of memory and ritual rather than force. Language itself became a vessel of survival. Celtic tongues continued to flourish in everyday life, carrying the cadence of song, the structure of law, and the lexicon of myth. Poetry was more than art. It was history, theology, and philosophy combined. To speak and listen was to participate in a tradition stretching back centuries, a living bridge between ancestors and descendants. In every verse recited beside the hearth, the old world endured. Trade and contact with the continent persisted, even if lightly. Artifacts show that jewelry, bronze tools, and ceremonial objects continued to arrive from Gaul, carrying design and skill across the waters. Yet the island's Celts adapted these influences, weaving them into local styles and stories. There was continuity but also transformation, a dialogue between familiar traditions and distant innovation. New kingdoms began to emerge on both islands, modest in scale but rich in culture. In Ireland, the Uí and other dynasties traced their lineages back to mythic ancestors, consolidating territories while preserving the spiritual framework of the Druids. In Britain, petty kings governed over tribal lands, balancing power through alliances, marriage, and negotiation. Leadership remained relational, rooted in honor and service rather than rigid hierarchy. These small polities were fragile, yet resilient, their endurance a testament to centuries of adaptation. Even under the shadow of Rome, Celtic religion persisted. Sacred groves, hilltop fires, and seasonal festivals continued in secret or adaptation. Druids maintained teachings of nature, law, and cosmology, guiding the people quietly through the cycles of life. Saints and monastic figures would later blend this knowledge into Christian practice, preserving continuity even as forms changed. The rhythm of faith, of connection to the land, to ancestors, and to cosmic cycles remained unbroken. Art and craftsmanship flourished in this enduring society. Intricate metalwork, spirals, and interlacing designs reflected both aesthetic skill and spiritual symbolism. Jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial items carried motifs that spoke of continuity, memory, and identity. In these objects, every curve and coil was a story, every inlaid gem a fragment of the old worldview kept alive across generations. Oral tradition, above all, ensured survival. Bards traveled between communities, reciting epic tales, genealogies, and moral parables. These performances were not entertainment alone. They encoded history, law, and philosophy into forms that could outlast destruction. Through story, the people remembered victories and losses, heroes and gods, ensuring that even when empires fell, the Celtic soul remained unbroken. The resilience of the Isles Celts was not merely cultural but also strategic. By embracing adaptability, preserving core values while negotiating change, they survived waves of migration, conquest, and religious transformation. Each generation became a link in a chain that stretched back to continental tribes and forward to the future. Their islands, isolated yet connected by sea and story, became vessels of endurance. In the twilight of Roman influence, a quiet transformation began. Christianity arrived not as a conqueror but as a companion, slowly merging with old rituals. Saints like Patrick in Ireland and Columba in Scotland incorporated native beliefs, creating monasteries where learning, art, and scripture thrived. The old myths were remembered, now intertwined with new faith, ensuring that imagination and devotion continued to shape life in the Isles. Even as kingdoms shifted and borders changed, the Celtic people retained their identity. The language of bards, the patterns of metal and stone, the memory of sacred groves, all persisted, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Though empires rose and fell elsewhere, here was a world where heritage endured not through domination, but through quiet devotion, observation, and care. The winds that sweep the cliffs and plains of Britain and Ireland carry the whispers of these enduring people. Every river, every hill, every circle of stones tells of survival and memory. In their resilience, we see the power of continuity. A civilization able to adapt without losing its essence, to endure without surrendering its spirit. In the twilight of empire, the Celts began to dream in new forms, of monks, saints, and myths reborn. The stories that emerged from the Isles would ripple forward, shaping literature, belief, and identity for centuries to come, proving that endurance itself is a kind of immortality. In the quiet valleys and misty hills of the Celtic Isles, a new light began to dawn. Christianity arrived not with the force of an army, but with the gentle persistence of teaching and devotion. Missionaries traveled across rivers, through forests, and over rocky coasts, carrying not only scripture but a vision of faith that could coexist with the deep rhythms already ingrained in Celtic life. Their arrival did not erase the old ways. Instead, it intertwined with them, creating a tapestry of belief that was both ancient and new. Monasteries began to appear, rising from the land as centers of reflection, learning, and artistry. Built with timber and stone, they were often located near sacred sites, hills, springs, and groves that had long been places of veneration. Within their walls, monks chanted psalms and copied texts, preserving knowledge not only of Christianity but also of the Celtic oral tradition. The hum of prayer blended with the whisper of nature outside, creating an atmosphere of serene continuity. The illuminated manuscript became a symbol of this synthesis. Monks decorated pages with intricate interlace, spirals, and symbolic animals, echoes of the Celtic artistic language. The Book of Kells, centuries later, would exemplify this fusion. Vibrant colors and abstract forms filled with sacred meaning, celebrating both the Christian gospel and the visual heritage of the Celts. Each stroke of ink was an act of devotion, a meditation on eternity, and a bridge between past and present. Christian festivals were adapted to local cycles, subtly merging with older Celtic celebrations. Samhain's reflection on ancestors became aligned with All Saints and All Souls. The seasonal rhythms, planting, harvest, and midsummer, were incorporated into liturgical observances. Through this blending, the people experienced continuity rather than disruption, finding that the sacred order they had long known could inhabit a new form. Druids and bards, once the principal keepers of knowledge, gradually transformed their roles. Many found place within the monastic system, preserving history, law, and poetry in written form. Oral traditions were committed to vellum, securing centuries of stories for future generations. This was not a replacement, but an evolution. The essence of Celtic culture persisted, now entwined with Christian thought, creating a civilization both rooted and forward-looking. Learning flourished in these sanctuaries. Monks cultivated not only spiritual discipline but also scholarly inquiry. Astronomy, medicine, and natural history were recorded alongside scripture. Gardens and herbal collections became living classrooms, linking observation with faith. Knowledge became a sacred rhythm, a continuity that mirrored the cycles of the land and sky. Pilgrimage and travel spread this synthesis further. Monks and nuns carried manuscripts, relics, and teachings across the Isles and beyond. Small communities became nodes in a network of learning and spirituality, connecting Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and northern England. Through this network, Celtic Christianity influenced distant lands, leaving a legacy of artistry, scholarship, and devotion that would endure long after the age of empires had passed. Even daily life retained its ceremonial depth. Families observed prayer and ritual in ways reminiscent of their ancestors, integrating Christian blessings with the rhythms of work and festival. Wells remained sacred, rivers were blessed, and hearths were consecrated. In these acts, the spiritual landscape was neither abandoned nor overwritten. It was transformed, enriched, and extended. The fusion of faith also fostered creativity in architecture and craft. Round towers, stone crosses, and intricately carved reliquaries reflected a worldview in which spirituality, art, and daily life were inseparable. Symbols of the old and new coexisted. Spirals danced alongside crosses, knotwork intertwined with sacred inscriptions, and every creation spoke of continuity, reverence, and wonder. Despite this integration, the world beyond the Celtic Isles was changing rapidly. Kingdoms rose and fell on the continent, trade routes shifted, and empires advanced and receded. The islands, once remote, were slowly drawn into broader European currents. Yet within their monasteries and sacred groves, a quiet transformation occurred, one that was measured not in conquest, but in the patient weaving together of old wisdom and new revelation. In the hush of stone and timber halls, the people discovered that faith could be both anchor and bridge. They preserved memory while embracing change, honoring the rhythms of ancestors while walking forward in the light of new understanding. The Celtic heart, tempered by centuries of adaptation, found in Christianity not a contradiction, but a continuation of the sacred order that had always guided life on these misted shores. Yet while belief evolved in these quiet valleys, the wider world pressed onward. Trade, conquest, and migration reshaped Europe, and the Celtic peoples, resilient and adaptive, would meet these changes in ways both subtle and profound, carrying the rhythm of their past into the unfolding currents of history. Across the green hills and misty coastlines of the post-Roman Celtic world, kingdoms rose like whispers of the past. Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and Brittany became homes for communities that had survived the tides of empire, carrying with them the memory of a people who had once traversed continents and rivers in search of freedom. Here, power was measured not only in arms or wealth, but in the preservation of language, law, and story, the subtle architecture of identity. In Wales, small kingdoms such as Gwynedd and Powys maintained continuity through oral tradition and poetic courts. Bards served as the living memory of the people, reciting genealogies, heroic tales, and moral lessons to both nobles and villagers. These stories were more than entertainment. They were repositories of history and law, carrying forward customs and values that had survived centuries of upheaval. Each tale recited beside a hearth reinforced the connection between past and present, ensuring that even in times of political fragmentation, the Celtic spirit endured. Scotland, too, nurtured its kingdoms amid highlands and islands, where mist-shrouded mountains held secrets of ancestral deeds. Clans governed through a combination of kinship and counsel, and warriors trained not for conquest alone, but to defend their kin and uphold honor. Oral histories, often sung or chanted, preserved the knowledge of land, lineage, and sacred sites. Even in the harshness of winter, the rhythm of life was guided by memory and ritual, a continuity of practice that allowed communities to endure. Ireland, perhaps the most poetically fertile of the Isles, became a sanctuary for law and legend. The Brehon laws, administered by trained jurists, offered a system of governance that valued fairness, restitution, and social harmony over violence. Druids and learned scholars merged into monastic traditions, ensuring that legal codes, histories, and genealogies were carefully recorded and remembered. Villages and kingdoms thrived on networks of kinship and patronage, and in every hall, the voices of bards carried forward the echoes of continental ancestors. Brittany, across the sea, remained a land of memory and adaptation. Migrants from Gaul had brought their language, art, and customs, which blended with local traditions to form a distinctly Breton identity. Hillforts and settlements continued to dot the landscape, but now their significance lay as much in cultural continuity as in defense. Poetry, law, and song maintained a rhythm of life that resonated with the ancestral voices of Gaul, creating a bridge across both space and time. Across all these lands, myth became a vessel of identity. Heroes, gods, and supernatural beings inhabited stories that guided behavior, taught ethics, and preserved memory. Figures like Cú Chulainn, Finn Mac Cumhaill, and King Arthur, whether historical, semi-historical, or entirely legendary, embodied ideals of courage, wisdom, and honor. Their tales traveled between generations, carried by bards whose voices were trained to evoke emotion, reflection, and moral understanding. In storytelling, the Celts found a form of immortality, where past deeds shaped present life and future imagination. Communities honored the land itself as a sacred partner. Rivers, hills, and forests were not merely resources but living companions in the narrative of life. Sacred wells and groves continued to hold significance, sites for prayer, ritual, and assembly. Festivals marked seasonal rhythms, echoing the ancient calendar of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh. In these practices, faith and culture were inseparable, maintaining the spiritual pulse of the people even as external pressures shifted. Art, too, reflected this enduring consciousness. Manuscripts illuminated with spirals, knotwork, and animal motifs celebrated both the sacred and the heroic. Jewelry and ceremonial objects preserved motifs inherited from centuries of continental Celtic craftsmanship. Every creation was a testament to memory, a way to make the unseen visible, to embed history and meaning into tangible forms. In the hands of artisans, the past remained present, its patterns guiding aesthetic and ethical life alike. Trade and contact continued, though more localized. Communities exchanged tools, livestock, and decorative items, while knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and navigation flowed quietly through monastic and bardic networks. Even amid isolation, the islands were never entirely cut off. Their people engaged in a dialogue with neighboring lands, learning and adapting while maintaining continuity of identity. The languages spoken across these Celtic kingdoms, Welsh, Gaelic, Breton, became repositories of worldview. Every word, idiom, and verse carried subtle knowledge of social order, cosmology, and ethics. To speak the language was to participate in an inheritance, to be part of a living chain linking contemporary life to centuries of ancestry. Oral recitation, storytelling, and song were not mere entertainment, but acts of cultural preservation and subtle governance. Even as political boundaries shifted and small wars flared between neighboring kingdoms, the Celts' focus on memory and law created cohesion. Leadership was understood as service rather than dominion, and rulers were expected to protect the continuity of law, culture, and spirituality. The balance between freedom and unity, individual valor and communal responsibility, remained central to Celtic identity. In the twilight of this era, the islands became repositories of an ancient civilization's wisdom. Here, stories, songs, and sacred practices endured, subtly shaping the rhythm of life and maintaining a sense of belonging across generations. The past was neither frozen nor abandoned. It lived in the minds and hearts of those who remembered, guiding action, teaching ethics, and sustaining identity. And so, from story to legend, the Celts passed into a new kind of eternity. Through the mists of memory and the green hills of their homelands, their voices continued to echo, shaping literature, myth, and culture for centuries yet to come. Even when the world seemed to fall silent, the stories of the Celts continued to breathe. Legends were not idle fantasies. They were vessels of memory, carrying the spirit, values, and imagination of a people who had traversed continents, fought battles, and nurtured communities. Among these tales, the Tuatha Dé Dan stand as a luminous example, a race of gods and heroes who embodied both the mystery of nature and the aspirations of human courage. They were not distant deities, but mirrors of the living world, wise, capricious, and deeply intertwined with the land itself. In the mist-laden hills of Ireland, these stories shaped perception. Rivers and lakes were not mere water, but portals of power and presence. Hills were not inert, but stages for epic encounters. Each myth carried layered meaning, reflecting social values, moral dilemmas, and the subtle laws of the universe. The Celts had a profound understanding that the world was alive, and that every story, every song, reinforced the connection between human life and the cosmos. The figure of Lugh, radiant and skilled in many arts, exemplified the ideal of the Celtic hero: versatility, wisdom, and courage united in one being. Tales of his feats were not only entertaining but instructive, teaching listeners the importance of knowledge, creativity, and ethical action. Similarly, the goddess Brigid represented inspiration, healing, and transformation, a reminder that human endeavor and spiritual insight were intertwined. Through these narratives, the people encoded guidance for living well, a morality embedded in myth rather than written decree. Arthurian echoes, though layered and evolving, emerged from this same wellspring of imagination. The Round Table, knights, and quests reflect both the aspirations and anxieties of a culture seeking justice, unity, and honor. These stories, though often recorded centuries later, carry traces of older Celtic motifs. The interplay of fate and free will, the reverence for nature, and the ideal of leadership as service rather than dominion. In hearing or reading these tales, audiences connect not just to the narrative, but to the ethical and aesthetic sensibilities of their ancestors. Druidic lore, once the province of secret groves and oral ritual, also survived through myth. Though Roman chroniclers described the Druids with fascination and fear, it was through stories and allegories that their wisdom endured. Their teachings on the cycles of life, the harmony of the natural world, and the cultivation of memory became embedded in legend. The sacred knowledge of Druids lived on in moral tales, heroic epics, and even in the rhythms of seasonal celebration. Even small details of daily life found their way into legend. Festivals like Samhain and Beltane, once marking agricultural and spiritual cycles, were preserved in story as liminal moments, thresholds where the ordinary met the supernatural. Heroes wandered through these spaces, encountering spirits, magical weapons, or transformative challenges. Through this mythic lens, everyday human experience was imbued with wonder, and ordinary landscapes became sacred theater. Art and symbol complemented story, reinforcing mythic memory. Spirals, knots, and animal motifs encoded meaning into jewelry, weaponry, and manuscript illumination. A dragon carved on a brooch or a spiral inked into vellum was never mere decoration. It was a narrative in form, a visual echo of values, cosmology, and memory. These symbols allowed myths to persist even when words were forgotten, ensuring that cultural continuity was maintained across generations. Bards played a central role in this inheritance. Traveling between villages and courts, they preserved both history and myth, embedding ethical guidance and communal memory in song and recitation. Each performance was an act of renewal, allowing listeners to participate in the unfolding of the past, even as they reflected on their present. To hear a bard was to step into a living continuum, where the boundary between past and present, human and divine, was fluid and sacred. Even as time and conquest reshaped the Celtic world, myths continued to act as anchors. They preserved a sense of identity amid displacement, offering a stable framework in a shifting landscape. In the quiet of night, in the soft glow of firelight, the stories of heroes, gods, and spirits invited reflection, offering solace, guidance, and wonder. In every retelling, there is continuity. The myths of the Tuatha De Danann, Arthurian legends, and Druidic wisdom are not relics, but living echoes, demonstrating how imagination can preserve culture, ethics, and memory across centuries. They remind us that civilizations endure not only through structures or conquest, but through the stories they choose to remember. Yet every myth points back to the people who first breathed it into being, whose courage, creativity, and care made legend possible. From those earliest breaths, the Celtic spirit persists, a quiet inheritance that continues to inspire, comfort, and awaken wonder in every listener who hears it beneath the stars. Though millennia have passed, the song of the Celts still lingers, soft, persistent, eternal. Across the green hills of Ireland, the rugged coastlines of Wales, the highlands of Scotland, and the quiet villages of Brittany, traces of the Celtic world endure. They appear not in the form of empires or armies, but in language, music, art, and the very rhythm of life. The ancient world lives on in subtle ways, reminding us that culture is never truly lost. It transforms, whispers, and blooms again. Language remains one of the most tangible links to this heritage. Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and Welsh carry the cadence of centuries, their sounds echoing ancient oral traditions. Each word is a vessel of memory, preserving thought patterns, expressions, and philosophies that once guided tribal and communal life. Poetry, song, and storytelling continue to flourish in these tongues, connecting contemporary listeners to the voices of ancestors. Even for those who do not speak the languages fluently, the sound itself, rising in song, soft in conversation, evokes the cadence of a world long past, yet vividly alive. Music, too, carries the heartbeat of the past. The lilting strains of harp, fiddle, bagpipe, and bowron evoke landscapes once traversed by Celts on foot, by river, and across misty hills. Folk songs recount heroic deeds, love, and loss, often echoing myths preserved through oral tradition. Modern festivals, such as the Eisteddfod in Wales or the Fled Che Oil in Ireland, keep these melodies alive, creating spaces where communities gather to celebrate both history and living culture. Through music, the ancient pulse of the Celts can be felt as clearly as if it were echoing from a hill fort long ago. Art and craft reflect the same continuity. Intricate knotwork, spirals, and animal motifs appear in modern jewelry, tattoos, and public sculpture, drawing inspiration from Celtic manuscripts and metalwork. Contemporary artists reinterpret these forms, merging tradition with innovation, creating works that speak to both past and present. In every curve and interlace, there is a quiet dialogue between centuries, a reminder that heritage survives when it is cherished and reimagined. Festivals and seasonal celebrations continue to honor cycles that were once central to Celtic life. Samhain has become modern Halloween, yet in many areas, its older associations with the turning of the year, remembrance of ancestors, and liminal space remain. Beltane fires and midsummer gatherings persist in folk tradition and community ceremonies, blending music, dance, and ritual in ways that echo ancient practice. Through these observances, the rhythm of life, tied to earth, sky, and memory, continues to guide communal consciousness. Even literature reflects Celtic echoes. Writers, poets, and storytellers have long drawn upon Celtic myths and histories for inspiration. Legends of Cú Chulainn, Finn Mac Cumhaill, and the Tuatha De Danann have been retold, reimagined, and woven into novels, plays, and modern fantasy. These stories serve not merely as entertainment, but as cultural continuity, providing moral insight, imagination, and a sense of belonging that transcends time. Through literature, the Celts' ethical and aesthetic vision reaches new generations, ensuring that their worldview continues to influence how people think, feel, and dream. Language and art are not the only repositories of memory. Place names themselves carry history. The rolling hills, rivers, and forests of the Celtic Isles bear names that preserve ancient narratives. Every glen, every loch, and every hill can be read as a story, a marker of lineage, legend, or sacred significance. In this way, the landscape itself becomes a living archive, one that invites reflection and reverence for the layers of human experience embedded within it. Education and scholarship have also played a vital role in preserving Celtic heritage. Universities, cultural institutes, and local societies study and teach Gaelic languages, Celtic art, and history. Museums display artifacts ranging from iron swords and jewelry to illuminated manuscripts, allowing modern audiences to engage with the material culture of the past. These efforts ensure that memory is not only preserved but also contextualized, providing understanding alongside appreciation. Celtic identity continues to thrive in communities both local and global. People celebrate ancestry, participate in cultural exchanges, and engage in movements that revive language and tradition. Modern Gaelic revival, for example, seeks not only to teach language but to instill pride in the worldview and practices that language encodes. Through these endeavors, individuals reconnect with the ethical and aesthetic values of their ancestors, fostering a sense of continuity that spans centuries. Even in daily life, echoes of the Celts remain. Traditional music playing on a radio, festivals lighting a village green, or a single symbol on a piece of jewelry. These are subtle reminders that civilization is never truly gone. The past persists not only in grand monuments, but in rhythm, story, and memory, carried in ways both visible and invisible. Each act of remembrance, each practice continued, strengthens the chain linking now to then. In the quiet hours, when night blankets the land, one can feel the resonance of Celtic heritage most profoundly. The wind moving through trees, the murmur of rivers, and the echo of music across hills. All are carriers of memory. They remind us that culture, once nurtured, never entirely disappears. It waits patiently, ready to be recognized, honored, and continued. Across modern landscapes, the Celts' legacy is a testament to endurance, creativity, and adaptability. From language and art to music, literature, and law, their influence persists. A gentle but persistent reminder that human culture is an inheritance, one that flourishes when it is remembered, respected, and reimagined. And so, beneath the stars, we return to the beginning to remember and to rest. The story of the Celts, from hillforts to bards, from warriors to monasteries, from myth to modern echo, is a continuous thread through time. In listening, imagining, and reflecting, we become part of that thread, carriers of memory, witnesses to enduring spirit, and companions on the journey through history's calm and luminous night. Though millennia have passed, the song of the Celts still lingers, soft, persistent, eternal. Across the green hills of Ireland, the rugged coastlines of Wales, the highlands of Scotland, and the quiet villages of Brittany, traces of the Celtic world endure. They appear not in the form of empires or armies, but in language, music, art, and the very rhythm of life. The ancient world lives on in subtle ways, reminding us that culture is never truly lost. It transforms, whispers, and blooms again. Language remains one of the most tangible links to this heritage. Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and Welsh carry the cadence of centuries, their sounds echoing ancient oral traditions. Each word is a vessel of memory, preserving thought patterns, expressions, and philosophies that once guided tribal and communal life. Poetry, song, and storytelling continue to flourish in these tongues, connecting contemporary listeners to the voices of ancestors. Even for those who do not speak the languages fluently, the sound itself, rising in song, soft in conversation, evokes the cadence of a world long past, yet vividly alive. Music, too, carries the heartbeat of the past. The lilting strains of harp, fiddle, bagpipe, and bodhrán evoke landscapes once traversed by Celts on foot, by river, and across misty hills. Folk songs recount heroic deeds, love, and loss, often echoing myths preserved through oral tradition. Modern festivals, such as the Eisteddfod in Wales or the Fled Che Oil in Ireland, keep these melodies alive, creating spaces where communities gather to celebrate both history and living culture. Through music, the ancient pulse of the Celts can be felt as clearly as if it were echoing from a hill fort long ago. Art and craft reflect the same continuity. Intricate knotwork, spirals, and animal motifs appear in modern jewelry, tattoos, and public sculpture, drawing inspiration from Celtic manuscripts and metalwork. Contemporary artists reinterpret these forms, merging tradition with innovation, creating works that speak to both past and present. In every curve and interlace, there is a quiet dialogue between centuries, a reminder that heritage survives when it is cherished and reimagined. Festivals and seasonal celebrations continue to honor cycles that were once central to Celtic life. Samhain has become modern Halloween, yet in many areas, its older associations with the turning of the year, remembrance of ancestors, and liminal space remain. Beltane fires and midsummer gatherings persist in folk tradition and community ceremonies, blending music, dance, and ritual in ways that echo ancient practice. Through these observances, the rhythm of life, tied to earth, sky, and memory, continues to guide communal consciousness. Even literature reflects Celtic echoes. Writers, poets, and storytellers have long drawn upon Celtic myths and histories for inspiration. Legends of Cú Chulainn, Finn Mac Cumhaill, and the Tuatha Dé Danann have been retold, reimagined, and woven into novels, plays, and modern fantasy. These stories serve not merely as entertainment, but as cultural continuity, providing moral insight, imagination, and a sense of belonging that transcends time. Through literature, the Celts' ethical and aesthetic vision reaches new generations, ensuring that their worldview continues to influence how people think, feel, and dream. Language and art are not the only repositories of memory. Place names themselves carry history. The rolling hills, rivers, and forests of the Celtic Isles bear names that preserve ancient narratives. Every glen, every loch, and every hill can be read as a story, a marker of lineage, legend, or sacred significance. In this way, The landscape itself becomes a living archive, one that invites reflection and reverence for the layers of human experience embedded within it. Education and scholarship have also played a vital role in preserving Celtic heritage. Universities, cultural institutes, and local societies study and teach Gaelic languages, Celtic art, and history. Museums display artifacts ranging from iron swords and jewelry to illuminated manuscripts, allowing modern audiences to engage with the material culture of the past. These efforts ensure that memory is not only preserved but also contextualized, providing understanding alongside appreciation. Celtic identity continues to thrive in communities both local and global. People celebrate ancestry, participate in cultural exchanges, and engage in movements that revive language and tradition. Modern Gaelic revival, for example, seeks not only to teach language but to instill pride in the worldview and practices that language encodes. Through these endeavors, individuals reconnect with the ethical and aesthetic values of their ancestors, fostering a sense of continuity that spans centuries. Even in daily life, echoes of the Celts remain. Traditional music playing on a radio, festivals lighting a village green, or a single symbol on a piece of jewelry. These are subtle reminders that civilization is never truly gone. The past persists not only in grand monuments, but in rhythm, story, and memory, carried in ways both visible and invisible. Each act of remembrance, each practice continued, strengthens the chain linking now to then. In the quiet hours, when night blankets the land, one can feel the resonance of Celtic heritage most profoundly. The wind moving through trees, the murmur of rivers, and the echo of music across hills. All are carriers of memory. They remind us that culture, once nurtured, never entirely disappears. It waits patiently, ready to be recognized, honored, and continued. Across modern landscapes, the Celts' legacy is a testament to endurance, creativity, and adaptability. From language and art to music, literature, and law, their influence persists. A gentle but persistent reminder that human culture is an inheritance, one that flourishes when it is remembered, respected, and reimagined. And so, beneath the stars, we return to the beginning to remember and to rest. The story of the Celts, from hillforts to bards, from warriors to monasteries, from myth to modern echo, is a continuous thread through time. In listening, imagining, and reflecting, we become part of that thread, carriers of memory, witnesses to enduring spirit, and companions on the journey through history's calm and luminous nights. As night descends over the hills and rivers of the Celtic lands, a gentle stillness settles across the valleys. The forests breathe in quiet rhythm, and the lochs mirror the soft glow of stars above. In this silence, one can sense the pulse of centuries, the ebb and flow of lives, stories, and songs that have traversed the long arc of time. The Celts, in their art, music, and myth, understood this subtle cadence. That life is a cycle, a pattern of return, reflection, and renewal. To look upon a Celtic knot is to see eternity captured in form. Its endless loops have no beginning, no end, only continuous pathways weaving over and under one another. So too is history. The rise and fall of tribes, the migrations, the battles and feasts, the quiet creativity of bards and monks, all are threads in a living tapestry. Each moment is distinct, yet part of a larger, unbroken design, reminding us that time is not a linear march but a series of interconnected cycles. In this quiet reflection, one perceives how intimately the Celts lived with nature. Seasons dictated rhythm. The sowing and reaping of fields, the festivals marking solstice and equinox, the turning of livestock and the migrations of birds. Every action acknowledged the larger pattern of life, embedding humanity within the natural world rather than above it. This awareness nurtured resilience, guiding communities through prosperity and hardship alike, and leaving behind a legacy of harmony and observation that continues to inspire. Memory, too, was a living element of their existence. From oral law to epic storytelling, from sacred groves to illuminated manuscripts, the Celts cultivated remembrance. Every song, every tale, and every symbol carried the wisdom of ancestors forward. They understood that to honor the past is to strengthen the present and illuminate the future. In this way, even the smallest communities, a village by a river, a family on a hillside, participated in the eternal flow of culture. The warriors and kings, the druids and bards, the farmers and artisans, all contributed to this enduring pattern. Each life was a note in the larger symphony, a single movement within the perpetual song of the people. Battles were fought not merely for territory, but for survival, identity, and continuity. Feasts were held not just for sustenance, but for community, gratitude, and remembrance. In both action and ritual, the Celts recognized their place within a cycle larger than themselves. Time in the Celtic view was both expansive and intimate. Moments of heroism, loss, and creation were anchored within the broader currents of seasons, celestial events, and ancestral memory. The past was always present, not as burden or shadow, but as companion. This relationship fostered patience, perspective, and a calm acceptance of change. By observing the cycles of nature and history, the Celts cultivated a form of wisdom that embraced both the transient and the eternal. Even today, these patterns endure in the cultural memory of the Celtic lands. Festivals, music, and storytelling echo the ancient rhythms, guiding hearts and minds with familiar cadence. The connection to land, to kin, and to story continues to shape identity, offering a quiet stability in a rapidly changing world. The past is not distant. It is a companion, a teacher, and a guide for those willing to listen. Art reflects this understanding in subtle ways. Spirals, knots, and interwoven motifs are more than decoration. They are meditations on continuity, cycles, and interconnectedness. Each creation invites contemplation, encouraging the viewer to trace its loops and return to its beginning over and over again. In this aesthetic, one glimpses the Celtic view of life, infinite, patterned, and serene. The quiet also reveals the emotional depth of the Celts. They celebrated life and mourned death, rejoiced in victory and reflected in loss. Their stories, myths, and songs carry both triumph and melancholy, acceptance and wonder. Listening to these echoes, one senses a civilization that embraced the full spectrum of human experience, cultivating empathy and insight as much as courage and skill. In this reflective silence, it becomes clear that the Celtic legacy is not confined to monuments, artifacts, or written records. It resides in patterns of thought, in the care with which communities related to land and one another, in the songs that have been passed through generations. It is alive in the rhythm of daily life, in the contemplation of nature, and in the remembrance of ancestors, a subtle, enduring current beneath the surface of the world. History, like the Celtic knot, is without end. The stories of hillforts, warriors, bards, monks, and saints intertwine with those of modern communities, forming a continuous tapestry. In observing these cycles, one recognizes a profound lesson: that civilization endures not only through conquest or architecture, but through memory, imagination, and reverence for the patterns of life. From the silence of the past, we awaken into the present, carrying their memory forward. As we close this meditation, the hills, rivers, and groves of the Celtic world remain alive in imagination and practice, a quiet inheritance inviting each of us to walk gently within the enduring flow of history. As twilight descends over the Celtic lands, the hills and valleys are bathed in a soft, amber glow. Mist rises from rivers and lochs, curling around ancient stones and standing trees, carrying with it whispers of centuries long past. In this quiet hour, one senses the gentle endurance of a culture that has survived storms, migrations, and the sweep of empires. The Celts' presence is not in monuments alone, but in the rhythm of land, memory, and story, subtle yet persistent, like the last light before night fully falls. Language continues to breathe life into these landscapes. Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton, spoken softly or sung aloud, carry echoes of ancestral voices. Each word is imbued with history, song, and worldview, connecting those who speak them to a continuum of thought and imagination stretching back thousands of years. In classrooms, hearths, and festivals, these tongues are nurtured and preserved, carrying forward lessons, poetry, and the cadence of storytelling that has defined the Celtic spirit. Music floats across the hills like wind, shaping memory in sound. The harp's delicate strings, the haunting call of the bagpipe, the lilting melody of a fiddle, all recall a lineage of creative expression that has endured beyond the reach of conquest or time. Through these songs, one can hear the pulse of ancient celebrations, the cadence of work and ritual, and the quiet heroism embedded in myth. Music becomes both mirror and vessel, reflecting the past while carrying it forward, ensuring that the essence of a people remains alive in each note. Art and symbolism continue their quiet testimony. Spirals, knots, and interwoven motifs appear in jewelry, manuscripts, and modern design, drawing direct inspiration from Celtic craft centuries old. Every curve and coil is more than aesthetic. It is a meditation, a memory, and a story encoded in form. In following the patterns with the eye, one glimpses the continuity of culture, a subtle reminder that human creativity endures, even when empires fade and landscapes shift. Stories, myths, and legends remain at the heart of this enduring culture. The heroes and deities of Old Lugh, Brigid, Cú Chulainn, Finn mac Cumhaill, continue to inhabit imagination, inspiring courage, ethical reflection, and wonder. Oral tradition, once the primary conduit for this knowledge, now thrives in books, performance, and digital media, ensuring that the tales of the Celts are shared, contemplated, and cherished. Each retelling strengthens the bridge between past and present, a living testament to human continuity and memory. Even the landscape itself holds the legacy of the Celts. Sacred hills, rivers, and groves, once the stages of ritual and celebration, still mark the land. These natural monuments, paired with human-made structures like stone circles, standing stones, and monastic ruins, tell a story that is both temporal and timeless. They remind us that culture is not only preserved in objects, but in the way communities inhabit, honor, and move through their environment. The endurance of Celtic culture is also found in practice. Seasonal festivals, rites of passage, and communal gatherings echo traditions that predate recorded history. Samhain, Beltane, Imbolc, and Lugnasad continue to shape the cycle of life, connecting contemporary communities with ancestral rhythms. By observing these patterns, people participate in a cultural inheritance that is at once intimate and expansive, reflecting values of reflection, gratitude, and harmony with the natural world. Scholarship and education have ensured that the lessons of the Celts are not lost. Archaeologists, historians, linguists, and artists study and interpret artifacts, manuscripts, and oral histories, revealing the complexity and depth of Celtic society. Through careful preservation and study, knowledge of social structures, belief systems, art, and governance has been transmitted, allowing both scholars and casual admirers to appreciate the richness of this enduring civilization. Even in modern life, subtle traces of Celtic identity flourish. Towns and villages carry names steeped in history. Local customs, music, and storytelling traditions offer continuity of memory. Individuals embrace language revival, craft, and artistic expression, linking themselves to a lineage of thought, imagination, and creativity that reaches across centuries. In each act of remembrance, the spirit of the Celts is renewed. In this twilight, it becomes evident that the story of the Celts is not one of endings, but of persistence. Their legacy is woven into the landscape, the languages, the music, and the imagination of those who follow. Civilization, as they demonstrate, is not measured solely by conquest or monuments, but by the continuity of thought, culture, and reverence for the rhythms of life. The last light of day falls softly upon the hills, yet within it glimmers a sense of enduring presence. Every stone, Every song, every whispered legend is a thread connecting the present to the distant past. The Celts remind us that memory, creativity, and respect for nature can transcend time, providing both guidance and comfort for generations yet to come. Thus ends our journey, but the story of the Celts, like the stars, never truly fades. In listening, imagining, and reflecting, we carry their memory forward. The fires of hearth and heart, the melodies of harp and voice, the spirals etched in metal and manuscript, all await recognition, ready to illuminate the night and inspire wonder for those who pause, breathe, and remember. As the night deepens and the hills of history fade into shadow, we invite you to linger a little longer with these stories. Let the echoes of the Celts inspire your imagination and carry their memory with you, in thought, in reflection, and in quiet wonder. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribing to Nightfall History to explore more civilizations, myths, and forgotten worlds, all told in a calm, cinematic voice designed to soothe and enlighten. Share this journey with fellow night wanderers and leave a comment with your favorite Celtic story or discovery from tonight's voyage. For those who wish to rest in the company of history, the next chapter awaits. A gentle immersion into another world, another people, another heartbeat of our shared past.